Before that turning point, Judith and Rick's relationship was strong, built on admiration and shared dreams. They met 15 years ago, fresh out of Rutgers University, and quickly bonded at a friend's party. After 2 years of dating, they moved in together and later married. They built a stable home and had 2 sons, Will and Robert, whom they raised with love. Judith had a successful career as a designer, and Rick was a supportive husband. However, as Judith's career took off, things shifted. Her long work hours began to strain the family. Though Rick was patient, subtle cracks in their relationship started to appear. Judith reassured herself that she could juggle her career and family life, believing she had it all under control. Judith often reflected on her good fortune, feeling lucky for her full life. At 40-something, she still admired her appearance, a tall, fit blonde with youthful eyes. These thoughts vanished as she packed for her upcoming trip to San Diego. She folded her clothes carefully and made sure her luggage was ready before Rick and the boys returned. The trip was a reward from Dalton Industries for a successful project launch. Judith was excited, though Rick hadn't been thrilled about her being away again. She had worked hard to convince him, and he eventually agreed, though not happily. Judith, a top designer at Casual Creations, specialized in packaging design. Her recent project was a success, and she was proud of her work, even though it meant spending long hours away from her family. As she prepared dinner that evening, she thought about the previous night with Rick. Their lovemaking had been intense, more passionate than usual. The memory made her want to make the evening special before leaving. Dinner was ready, and everything was on schedule as Rick and the boys arrived. Judith didn't want to dwell on the past. Right now, her focus was on her family, her husband Rick and their 2 boys, Will and Robert. Will, nearly 9, was carefree, while 7-year-old Robert was more serious. They balanced each other well, and Judith loved them equally. She and Rick had met at a party 15 years ago, instantly connecting despite attending Rutgers without crossing paths. After dating for 2 years, they moved in together and eventually married. She cherished the memory of Rick's proposal, and their life had been wonderful. When they were ready, they were blessed with 2 healthy boys. Judith had it all, though a slight chill ran through her at the thought, which she brushed off as nerves about her trip. She greeted her boys with hugs as they came home, Rick following close behind. She embraced Rick, noticing his tension. Although he relaxed, there was a shadow in his eyes. "You don't have to go, you know. We all want you to stay," Rick said, looking into her eyes. "It's too late now. It's just a quick business trip," she replied, attempting another hug, but he moved toward the powder room. Dinner was lively, with the boys talking about their day and upcoming school projects. Will wanted to make an erupting volcano for the science fair, while Robert preferred something unique. Their banter was good-natured, and Rick let them go on before eventually stepping in. Judith enjoyed the moment, but soon it was time to get ready. Rick insisted they'd clean up later. Packed and ready, Judith hugged and kissed her boys before sending them off to play. She turned to Rick. "I'll miss you all. It's just 3 nights. You'll pick me up Wednesday, right?" Rick nodded with a smile. "Don't worry. It's all set. You go enjoy yourself." Judith noticed the same darkness in his eyes, but before she could say anything, a car horn interrupted them. "That's Rachel. I'd better go," she said, giving Rick a quick hug and kiss before grabbing her bag and heading out the door. She glanced back, but Rick had already gone inside. Feeling uneasy, she told herself it was just her imagination. In the car, Rachel joked, 3 days at Redstone. Too bad you're so happily married. Could have been fun." Judith laughed, but couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It was too late to turn back now. At the airport, Judith checked her bags, went through security, and found her gate. Just as she sat down, Wes Southern joined her with a grin. "Ready for San Diego? Too bad we can't skip the meetings and just stay in bed," he joked, referencing their previous encounters. Judith smiled despite her unease, knowing they'd have plenty of time together during the trip. She and Wes had started their affair 2 months earlier after a long day at work. Exhausted, they fell asleep on her office couch, and when she woke, she mistook Wes's touch for Rick's. Guilt battled pleasure, but she gave in. What began as a one-time encounter soon became more frequent, though they kept it casual and secret, using protection to avoid complications. Over time, her guilt faded, and she resumed closeness with Rick, though something still felt off. Judith convinced herself the affair wasn't serious and that it didn't affect her marriage. This trip, although it gave her time alone with Wes, still felt work-related and not like a full-blown affair. She rationalized that everything would return to normal afterward, and she would refocus on Rick. In San Diego, after checking in, Judith called home and spoke to her boys for an hour. But when she asked for Rick, they said he was upstairs and quickly hung up. She was confused. Why had Rick been so quick to get rid of her? Could he suspect something? She brushed off the thought, assuming it was just guilt, and met Wes for dinner. After dinner, they headed to her room, eager to be together. The night was filled with passion, and they eventually fell asleep before dawn. But in the early morning, as Judith drifted between sleep and wakefulness, she felt a deep sense of loneliness and sadness. The intensity of it woke her, repeating, "No, no, no." Drenched in sweat, she got up and stood in the shower, trying to wash away the feeling. The 3 days flew by, with nights filled with sex between Judith and Wes. Though it had always been exciting due to the secrecy, it soon began to feel routine. The thrill faded, and by the end of the trip, they both agreed to end the affair on good terms. Judith was eager to return home to Rick and the boys, but she hadn't been able to reach them the last 2 nights. Her calls went unanswered, with only the answering machine picking up. At the airport, she tried calling Rick's office, but there was no answer, so she left a reminder about picking her up. She boarded the plane and quickly fell asleep, despite Wes's joking comment about joining the Mile High Club. When they landed at Kennedy, Wes stayed behind as Judith headed to baggage claim, expecting Rick to be there, but instead of Rick, she saw a man holding a sign with her name. He explained he was sent to pick her up and take her home. Assuming Rick was just busy, Judith agreed and got into the limo. She called Rick's phone again, but only got his voicemail. Now she was starting to worry. The drive seemed endless, and all her attempts to contact Rick failed. When they finally reached her house, it looked dark and deserted. Before she could get out, the driver handed her an envelope with her name on it in Rick's handwriting. Feeling panicked, she grabbed her bag and rushed inside. The house was quiet with only a few lights on. She searched every room, but no one was home. Upstairs in their bedroom, everything seemed normal until she noticed Rick's closet door was open, something he never left that way. When she looked closer, she realized all of his clothes were gone. Rick had left. Feeling sick to her stomach, Judith slowly walked into her boys' room. The beds were made, but their computers, favorite posters, and clothes were all gone. Panic rising, she ran downstairs searching for a note, then remembered the manila envelope. Grabbing it from the kitchen table, she tore it open and collapsed into a chair. Inside were photos, a report from Spaulding Investigations, and a document titled Decree for Dissolution of Marriage. Judith screamed. Overwhelmed by grief, she cried uncontrollably, pleading for another chance, throwing dishes in her despair until she finally passed out. When she woke to the morning sunlight, she numbly gathered the papers she'd thrown across the room. The first thing she saw were the photos, incriminating shots of her and Wes. She rushed to the sink, her stomach turning, then returned to the table, pushing the rest of the pictures aside. The report detailed her affair, with dates, times, and photo references documenting her betrayal. Judith didn't have the strength to read more and laid the report down. The legal document, thick and official, sat there, but she couldn't face reading it. Instead, she opened the envelope with a note from Rick. The letter began, "Judith, by now you know the boys and I are gone. I took our clothes, some of the boys' important things, and my stuff from the den. We're in a small apartment for now until we divide our assets," Rick continued, explaining how he found out about the affair. One night, after she said she'd be working late, he brought her a milkshake, only to discover her with Wes in her office. He had watched briefly, then left with the milkshake, thankful the boys had stayed in the car. That night, he told her he had a headache, a night she likely wouldn't even remember. She remembered that night vividly. It was the first time she and Wes had slept together. Overcome with guilt, she had dreaded facing Rick. But when she got home, Rick said he wasn't feeling well, and she was relieved she didn't have to talk to him. She even said a small prayer of thanks. Rick's letter continued, explaining how he had hired a private investigator, hoping it was just a one-time mistake. But it wasn't. The investigator easily installed a camera in her office after Rick copied her key. Rick admitted he couldn't look at many of the photos, though she seemed to be enjoying herself with Wes. When Judith mentioned the business trip, Rick had already planned to move out while she was gone. He learned Wes was joining her, though she had lied about who would be there. Rick expressed his anger, feeling betrayed, not just by the affair, but by the deliberate deception. He could have forgiven a single mistake, but not a planned betrayal. Rick assured her his lawyer would contact her soon, and he hoped they could settle custody and visitation peacefully. Though he no longer loved her, he wanted the boys to stay in their home. He ended the letter by saying they had nothing more to discuss and that he was done with her. Judith now understood the fear and dread she had been feeling. It was her conscience trying to warn her. But it was too late. Rick was gone, and she had lost everything. Years passed, and Judith and Rick led separate lives, both achieving success in their careers. Judith owned her own company, having built it through hard work. Sitting in her office, she shuffled papers on her desk, trying to make a decision. She reminded herself she didn't need to please anyone but her client, yet she was struggling. She thought about how Rick had always been a great sounding board for her ideas. She picked up her 3 best concepts and murmured, "Let's see what he'd think of these." She started with the weakest one, imagining Rick's feedback, knowing it needed improvement. Then she moved on to the next. Still nothing. Damn, he was tough. That's why I always turned to him for advice. Okay, here's the last one. 2 people are holding hands, walking down the street, unaware of a speeding car heading toward them. The man says, "I got the papers from our Continental insurance agent today. We're covered for anything." In the background, the car swerves and hits a light pole instead. They walk away, oblivious to the danger. "Yeah, that's the best one. The client will like it. I'll have Clark start on it tomorrow. Tonight I'm too tired." I stood up, turned off the light, and saw Will in the doorway. He smiled sadly. "Talking to Dad again?" "Yeah, it helps," I said. And it did. Talking to Rick always made things clearer. "What are you doing up? You have school tomorrow?" "Just getting water. I'm not missing the final game tomorrow." "Neither am I. We'll be behind the bench cheering you on." He smiled and walked off to bed. Tomorrow was the final basketball game, and if Will's team won, they'd go to the state quarterfinals. It was a long shot, but Will, a starting guard and senior, was hopeful. He was tall, strong, and had the talent for a scholarship. He was his father's son. I followed him to the kitchen, watching him finish his water before waving goodnight. I sat down, not ready for bed. Will was smart, not as brilliant as Robert, but still sharp. He had heard me talking to Rick again, and while he accepted it, Robert hated it. Rick and I divorced after 15 years of marriage, and today marked 8 years since it became official. It was my fault, and I had told the boys when they were old enough. Will took it hard, but eventually forgave me. Robert took longer. After the divorce, Rick never tried to take the boys away from me. He wanted unlimited visitation, and I agreed because having my boys was all I had left. When I went through dark times, Rick took the boys until I was stable. They supported me, likely with Rick's help, and were the reason I kept going. As they grew older, they spent more time at home and less with Rick, who was busy with work. I let them have their freedom, and they became strong, confident young men. Rick and I rarely spoke except about the boys. Financially, we were both stable, so there were no issues with alimony or child support. Over the years, we found a way to cooperate and support each other when needed. It was a peaceful, comfortable arrangement. After several hard years, I don't think Rick ever forgave me, but at least he no longer seemed to hate me. That was a relief. I still talked to him in my mind because I never stopped loving him or relying on his advice. Even though he wasn't there, I could imagine our conversations clearly, and it always helped. It kept me sane, especially during the dark times after our divorce when I almost drowned in depression. Rick was cold for the first 2 years after the divorce. He wouldn't speak to me or let me explain, though I wasn't even sure why I did what I did. His lawyer handled everything, and when I resisted, Rick threatened to change the divorce terms and take the boys. I gave in and signed what he wanted. After the divorce, I spiraled. I threw myself into my job, the only thing I had besides my boys. Though Wes was still around, we had no contact by mutual agreement, but he bragged about our affair, which hurt my reputation at work. People saw me differently, and I became isolated. One night, a colleague asked me out. I initially refused, but then accepted, thinking it might help me move on. I drank too much, and we ended up at his place. The sex was rough and quick, leaving me feeling empty, but I convinced myself I didn't need Rick. Over the next few weeks, I went on more dates, but they all ended the same, unsatisfying and leaving me feeling used. One night, I woke up on the floor of my living room, disheveled and alone, with only vague memories of the evening. I couldn't remember who I had been with, but I knew I had hit rock bottom. That night, I realized how far I'd fallen. Shame and disgust washed over me, and I questioned what I had become. Thankfully, my boys were with their father that weekend, sparing them from seeing me at my lowest. Eventually, I calmed down enough to clean up and make some important decisions. I found an old phone book in Rick's office and scheduled a doctor's appointment. I also resigned from my job, knowing I had to move forward. My sons kept me going, but I was alone most days while they were in school. I came close to doing something reckless more than once, but I didn't, which was a miracle. Before I lost everything, I saw a therapist, Cheryl Hopkins, recommended by my doctor. She put me on medication and helped me slowly regain control of my life. At first, I barely held on, but over time, I fought my way back. Through therapy, I realized that even though I had everything, a successful career, 2 wonderful boys, and a loving husband, it wasn't enough for me. I didn't know why, but I went looking for something more. That's how my affair with Wes began. He was attractive and flirtatious, and I responded. The thrill of the forbidden outweighed the guilt, and we started an affair that lasted 3 months, culminating in the San Diego trip. But it cost me my marriage. I continued working, but my reputation had suffered. Wes had talked about our affair, and I became known more for that than my professional skills. Though I had the option of claiming sexual discrimination, I chose not to stir trouble as long as they left me alone. I also made poor decisions by dating men who took advantage of my vulnerability. These meaningless encounters left me feeling empty, and I eventually realized I had hit rock bottom. That's when I called my doctor and began the long climb out of my depression, with Cheryl's relentless support. It took 2 years, but I finally recovered, though I still check in with her occasionally. I quit my job and left that chapter behind, but I needed to work for my own sanity. Rick had left me the house and enough financial support, but I wanted to build something new. So I started my own business, J. Proctor Packaging Concepts, from home. I used some equity from the house to get a loan and bought the necessary equipment: a high-performance computer, color copier, drafting board, and tools for graphic design and packaging. With that, I began rebuilding my life. At the time, Will had just turned 13, and Robert was 11. They helped a lot, giving me time to work in the evenings while they entertained themselves. It was a good setup. We compromised. I took them to their games, and they gave me quiet time to focus on my business. They understood what I was trying to do, and we worked as a team. It was a great period in my life as I started gaining clients. At first, I got a few referrals from former colleagues. I lost the first 2 accounts but secured the third, and my business began to grow. As it expanded, I hired a small team to handle calls, drafts, and sales. I had a small office built behind the house, which worked perfectly. Over the next 2 years, my business grew steadily, and I became financially successful, paying off my loans. Fast forward a few more years. Will was 17. Robert was almost 16, and I had turned 48. My business was thriving with 12 employees, and I kept it small, focusing on clients who wanted top-quality work. I was financially secure, and the boys had everything they needed. I didn't rely on Rick much anymore, and he agreed to put his support payments into a college fund for the boys. Will was likely to get a basketball scholarship to Ohio State, and Robert, being academically gifted, would easily secure one too. Both boys were popular. Will had a serious girlfriend, and Robert was starting to date as well. My business success brought social connections, and I was well known in the community, often invited to important events. But one thing was missing. I didn't date. Since crawling out of the emotional hole I had fallen into, I hadn't cared about any man. I had plenty of offers from wealthy single men, but I wasn't interested. I only cared about one man, Rick. When Rick left me, it was dramatic. He packed up and moved out while I was on a 3-day trip with Wes. I told Rick it was for business, which was true, but I didn't mention Wes. Rick already knew, though. He had everything documented. I foolishly believed I could keep the affair hidden, thinking consequences were for others. Ironically, during that trip, I realized I was done with cheating. I thought about Rick the whole time I was with Wes. By the end of the trip, I had recommitted to my marriage. But when I returned, Rick had already left, leaving behind photos, divorce papers, and a blunt letter saying we were finished. I deserved it. That triggered my depression, which took 2 years to overcome. Then I spent another 5 years building my business. Despite the divorce, I still considered myself married, holding on to the promise I made to myself on the plane ride back from San Diego, to rededicate myself to Rick. Even though it was too late, my pride wouldn't let me break that promise. During those years, I met several interesting men. I fantasized about a few, even having some erotic dreams, but my only indulgence was a blue toy I kept locked away. I used it occasionally when my boys were out for the night, and though I started thinking of those men, I always ended up thinking of Rick when I climaxed. Strange, right? Life, however, kept moving forward. The night after I had one of those thoughts, Robert and I were at Will's basketball game, and his team pulled off a huge upset, winning and advancing to the state quarterfinals. Will was ecstatic, and Robert was just as thrilled. Proud of my boys, I agreed to let Will's team celebrate at our house. We had the space, a pool, and enough parent chaperones to keep everything under control. The night was a success, and I set about rearranging my schedule to be there for the upcoming regional game. The next day, while working on my schedule in the kitchen, the phone rang. Without checking the caller ID, I answered, "Hello, this is Judith Proctor." Balancing the phone on my shoulder, I heard a voice I hadn't heard in a while. Rick. "Hi, Judith. It's me." His familiar voice sent a chill through me. "Yes, I recognized your voice. Good to hear from you. How have you been?" I replied. "Good. I was wondering about the regional game schedule. I want to see Will play, but don't know the details." "I'm just planning that now," I said. "The game is next Saturday in Columbus. Robert and I are driving down Friday night. We've got tickets, including one for you." "Could we get together for dinner?" Rick asked, surprising me. "The 4 of us before the game? I'd also like to sit with you and Robert during the game." Dinner together? We hadn't done that in the 8 years since our divorce. We were civil for the boys, but never spent time as a family. "Sure, that would be great," I replied, still processing the unexpected invitation. Will would love to see us together. I told him we were staying at the Madison Hotel, while the other families had rooms at the Marriott Courtyard. Rick was listed under Will's family, so booking a room would be easy. As I hung up, I couldn't help but wonder why he wanted to have dinner with us. Was it something new? Was he engaged? Or was there another reason for this sudden change? Rick mentioned he liked the idea of staying at the hotel and might book a room there. I said goodbye, still in shock from the call, and hoped I hadn't missed anything important. I pushed my emotions aside and finished my scheduling, which now felt even more significant. After all, I was going to have dinner with my ex-husband. The ex part didn't matter much to me. I didn't mention the dinner to Will or Robert until right before we left. Will had already spoken to Rick, knowing he planned to attend the game and spend time with them, but said nothing about us eating together. The night before the trip, I made sure the boys were packed and then called them to the kitchen for apple pie, something they both loved. "Boys, I have news. "The three of us are having dinner with your father the night before the game. He called and asked, and I said yes." I expected a reaction, but neither of them said a word. They just kept eating. Their casual attitude surprised me, but then I realized they saw it as normal for such a big event. To them, it wasn't a big deal, but to me, it was huge. I hadn't shared a meal with Rick in nearly 8 years. "Well, it's a big deal to me," I said. "I'm excited." Will looked up and smiled. "We know it's a big deal, Mom. Dad asked us if we were okay with it, and we said yes." I felt embarrassed. "Why didn't you tell me? I made such a fuss." Will reassured me. "You're the coolest mom. The team thinks so too. Dad's looking forward to it, and it'll be great if we can all get along." They teased me for overreacting, but I sensed their excitement too. After cleaning up, I packed the car, but my nerves only grew. I couldn't shake the thought that Rick had found someone new and would use this dinner to tell us. He had dated before, including a serious relationship with Leslie Wells a few years back, and I remembered how sick that conversation made me. Though their relationship ended, I feared Rick might now be ready for something more permanent, and dinner would be the moment he'd break the news. Rick's second serious relationship was about 1.5 years ago with a younger woman, Jean Chambers. She was at least 10 years younger than him. At first I found it amusing, but then I became concerned when he used the word love to describe her. I ended the conversation quickly. He never mentioned her again, but I assumed they were still together. I made it clear to my boys that their father's relationships were off limits in conversations with me, and they respected that. I was convinced this dinner was Rick's way of telling us he was going to propose to Jean. Rick would tell us before making it official. He was always polite and considerate. He had every right to move on, especially after what I did to him, but the thought still stung. The next day, we set off for the drive to Columbus for Will's quarterfinal game. Will was with his team on the bus, and Robert and I drove separately. I wanted to arrive early enough to shower, change, and prepare for dinner. I had a new dress, shoes, and jewelry, and even wore the perfume Rick bought me years ago. I wanted him to remember what he had walked away from. After checking in at the hotel, I let Robert have his own room, explaining he'd have to share with Will later. We decided to check if the team's bus had arrived, but we had beaten it by over an hour. While Robert led the way, I browsed the hotel lobby and nearby shops. Eventually, the bus arrived, and we saw Will with his girlfriend, Jill. After greeting her, Will spotted us and came over. He and Robert went to their room to change, while I headed back to the lobby to window shop and people watch. A short while later, I saw Rick walk in. It was both a shock and a thrill to see him again. I didn't make myself known, but watched as he checked in, efficiently as always. He still looked great, and I couldn't help but feel a rush of memories. Even when I fantasized about other men, it was Rick who always came to mind. I went back to my room to get ready and composed myself, making sure I was calm when Rick called. After finishing my hair and makeup, I checked on the boys. They were talking about the game, full of excitement. They looked handsome in clean shirts and pressed jeans. Okay, I pressed their jeans, but still. I returned to my room to finish getting ready. I wanted to put on my dress at the last moment to avoid wrinkles. As I fastened my necklace, the phone rang. It was Rick. "Are you ready?" he asked. 5 minutes, I replied, trying to steady my nerves. After hanging up, I started to panic. The reality of sitting down to dinner with Rick hit me hard. I called to the boys, and when they came into my room, Will whistled. "Wow, Mom, you look hot," he said with a grin. His compliment choked me up. I smiled and kissed him on the forehead, and as he pretended to protest, he whispered, "Go for it, Mom." I was ready. With Will's encouragement, my fears faded. I decided to enjoy the evening with my handsome sons and ex-husband, ignoring the consequences. I linked arms with the boys, and we headed to the elevator to meet Rick. Rick stood in the lobby holding a small box. When he saw us, he smiled and walked over. For a moment, we looked like a regular family, husband, wife, and 2 sons. Rick complimented me, saying I looked beautiful, and I thanked him, blushing. He greeted Robert with a teasing remark and shook Will's hand, sharing a meaningful glance with him. Then he handed Will the box. "This was given to me by my father when I went to college," Rick said. "Now it's time to pass it on to you." Will hesitated, then opened the box to reveal a gold pocket watch, intricately engraved. He admired it, clearly moved by the gesture. Robert was excited too, showing no jealousy. I felt a surge of pride in my boys, and a tear welled up in my eye, which I quickly wiped away. "Shall we sit down?" I said, trying to keep things light. Rick, understanding, gently took my arm, and we were seated in the restaurant. Rick sat next to me while Will and Robert sat across, both grinning. Dinner was fun. The boys devoured burgers and fries, while I had a salad and sandwich. Rick enjoyed a steak, and we all laughed and talked easily. For dessert, the boys had pie. Rick ordered sorbet, and I skipped. My dress was tight enough as it was. After dinner, the boys left to meet their curfew, leaving me alone with Rick for the first time in years. Surprisingly, I wasn't scared. I had already lost him long ago. Rick ordered coffee, and I nodded in agreement, wanting the evening to continue. We sat in comfortable silence, enjoying each other's company. I realized how much I had missed this connection. I wondered why we couldn't have parted as friends, but I knew the answer. The pain I had caused him was too deep to easily forgive. The waiter brought our coffee, pouring it for us before stepping away. Now we were truly alone. I wasn't sure what to say and wondered if I should be the one to start. After all, wasn't this the conversation I had wanted for so long but never had? Should I take the chance now and say the things I'd kept bottled up? Just as I worked up the nerve to speak, Rick turned to me. "Judith, can I ask you something? Just a few things that have been on my mind for a while, if that's okay." I was relieved that he started the conversation. "Of course, Rick. Anything. Just ask." He hesitated, then asked, "Is it true you talk to me as if I'm there? As if I'm actually with you?" That's what he wanted to ask? God, I'd prayed for this opportunity. "Yes, it's true," I admitted. "I've always done that, ever since I started the business. I valued your advice so much that, when you weren't around, I pretended you were. I knew you so well that I could imagine what you'd say, so I filled in for you. You have no idea how much you've helped me." Rick looked at me, surprised. "Why didn't you just call me for advice? Wouldn't that have made more sense?" "Rick, you made it clear you wanted nothing to do with me. We both know why. So why would I call you for advice?" I asked, holding his gaze. He nodded in understanding and looked away. For a moment, I thought I'd been too blunt, but then he turned back to me. "You never date," Rick said suddenly. "Why is that? I know things didn't work out after the divorce, but you're still beautiful and successful. I know plenty of men would love to go out with you. Why haven't you dated?" It was the question I'd expected, and I was ready for it. I took a deep breath and decided to be honest. What did I have to lose? I made a mistake 8 years ago, and I paid the price for it. I had no choice but to pay it, and I have. But after working with Cheryl Hopkins, my therapist, I realized there was only one man for me, and that man was you. I saw him about to object, so I quickly added, "Before you say anything, you need to understand. I made that promise on the flight home from San Diego. Wes and I had already ended our affair. I was ready to recommit to our marriage and to you. I realize now how naive that was, to think I could just walk back into your life after what I'd done. But nothing I did then was reasonable or fair. I know that now. I screwed up, Rick. It was all my fault. I take full responsibility." I watched Rick process what I was saying. Taking another deep breath, I continued. "After the divorce, I promised myself I'd be the perfect wife for you, even though I knew I couldn't be with you anymore. I've kept that promise, Rick. Even though we're divorced, I've stayed faithful. Dating someone else would feel like cheating on you. And I can't do that. I won't do that." Rick looked confused, unsure of what to say. I smiled gently and, after a few moments of silence, added, "And I'll tell you something the boys don't know. Sometimes I think of, well, let's just say inappropriate things I'd like to do with other men. But guess who I always end up with in my dreams?" Rick still looked puzzled, so I waited a few seconds before revealing the truth. "You, Rick. Even in my dreams, I can't cheat on you." I may imagine other men at first, but you're always the one I end up with." Watching his expression, I couldn't help but laugh. It was too funny. He had no idea how to respond, and for the first time in 8 years, I had the upper hand. God, how good it felt to say something serious, funny, and absurd to my ex-husband without any fighting or drama. It was just fun, and I realized I was enjoying myself. "You don't have to say anything," I said. "I just wanted to tell you the truth, whether you believe it or not. I know my credibility isn't exactly your top priority." Rick shook his head, still unsure how to take it or what to say. "I'm not sure I understand what you're saying, but that's fine. One more question, if you don't mind. What are your plans for the future? If you don't date and won't date anyone else, do you plan to stay single for the rest of your life? I can't believe that's what you want." Yes. There wasn't anything else to say. That was my choice, and I made it 6 years ago, after I emerged from that dark place. I explained it to Cheryl, and she accepted it as a reasonable decision. I had my reasons, and she knew them, so she never tried to change my mind. Rick looked at me, his eyes locked on mine. I met his gaze, my confidence in my own life and decisions giving me the strength to stand firm. If I couldn't have Rick because of what I did to him, then I'd paid the price, and I was free to make my own choices. I chose to be alone. Rick was still processing everything I had told him. I had been honest, given him the truth, and he knew it. There wasn't much for him to say, so he stayed quiet. I suggested we move to the lounge for a nightcap, and he gave me a look I didn't recognize. After 8 years, though, people change. Rick slid out of the booth, reached back to offer me his hand, and led me to the lounge. As I followed, I admired him from behind. He really was a striking man. He stopped to pay the bill while I waited in the lobby, noticing a few glances from men nearby. I was used to that kind of attention, and ignored most of it, except for a few interesting looks. But I never gave the wrong impression. No flirtatious gestures, no lingering eyes, nothing to suggest I was available. Rick came over, took my arm gently, and guided me into the lounge. We sat at a small table in the back, and instead of sitting across from me, he chose to sit beside me. I was pleasantly surprised and smiled widely. He smiled back. "Judith, I have to tell you something. Over the past 3 years, I've hired a private investigator to check up on you, just to prove to myself that Will and Robert weren't exaggerating about how you lived. I never wanted to invade your privacy, but I couldn't help but wonder about your personal life." My smile faded. After everything I'd done, I deserved to be punished. But what right did he have to keep tabs on me after all this time? It wasn't fair, and I felt a surge of anger. For the first time in years, I knew I had to say something to Rick, even if it risked pushing him away. After 8 years and a divorce where you cut me out of your life, you decided to investigate me? I never did that to you. I told the boys not to discuss you or bring your affairs or flings into my home. I respected your privacy. Why couldn't you do the same for me? "I'm sorry," he said. At first I told myself it was to protect the boys, but I knew that wasn't true. You were a great mother, and they've told me countless times how much they adored you and how you gave them everything they needed to thrive. Then I told myself I just wanted to see how you lived without a husband. That was closer to the truth. It shocked me to see how you lived. Never dating, only going out with women or clients. I couldn't understand why, and it drove me crazy. That's part of why I wanted to join you tonight and for the game tomorrow. I needed to see for myself that you're happy and content with your life. And I'm convinced you are. You're happier and more at peace than I ever saw you before. It's a real improvement. I listened carefully to everything Rick said, and strangely enough, I believed him. The Rick I knew wouldn't invade my privacy without a reason. This was his way, and I understood him. He was still looking out for me, and for our sons, of course. Well, I guess you had your reasons, but I would have appreciated it more if you had just asked me. We talked from time to time. You could have asked. Would you have answered me? Honestly? Yes, Rick, I would have. This is who I am now, the person I became 5 years ago. I'm not the same woman who cheated on you, the one you shattered. I know who I am now, and I know what I did. I've paid the price. What's the saying? Do the crime, Do the time. Well, I did the crime, and the time afterward was hell. For 3 years, I lived in darkness. First the divorce, then the fallout, the depression, the downfall. But I picked myself up and moved on. So yes, I would have told you everything. I would have welcomed the chance to explain why I did what I did. I prayed for the chance to say 2 things to you, Rick. Just 2 simple things. You were never at fault for any of it, and I'm so sorry for what I did. Rick listened intently, and when I finished, his eyes widened. I could see a glassiness in them, as if he was fighting back tears. Rick was a proud, strong man, and I knew how hard it was for him to let me see him like this. So, like any loving wife would do, I stood and excused myself to the ladies' room. I moved quickly to protect myself from breaking down in front of him. Once inside, I let myself go. I cried to release the tension, and when I finished, I was done. I had said what needed to be said. I was proud of myself, and I felt like a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. Those simple words had been incredibly powerful. I rinsed my face with water, reapplied my lipstick, and put a few drops in my eyes to hide the redness. I looked at my reflection. Yes, I was ready to go back. When I returned to the table, Rick was sitting with his hands folded in front of him. He looked up as I approached and greeted me with a huge smile, a look of pride. Proud to be with me. Be still, my heart. Silly girl. He stood like the gentleman he always was, and waited until I sat down. Then he surprised me by saying, "Thank you for giving me time to compose myself. You always did know me better than I knew myself." "I did," I replied, "but that's because I loved you so much. It came naturally. It still does, Rick. I still love you, you know." I nearly tensed, preparing for his reaction. I was ready for anything: anger, pain, disgust, surprise, even embarrassment. Any of those would make sense from someone I'd hurt as deeply as I hurt Rick. I was prepared for the worst. What he said next completely surprised me. "I believe you, Judith. I really do believe you love me now, and that you loved me then. I never doubted that. My actions weren't because I thought you loved Wes more than me. I divorced you because your betrayal hurt so badly that I couldn't find a way forward with you. And I tried. I really tried. When I found out what you were doing, I asked myself if I could forgive and forget. I was almost ready to accept it as a mistake we could move past. Then you lied about the San Diego trip and who you were going with. That's when I knew my love wasn't enough. I had no choice." As I listened, my heart broke. Not for me, but for him. His voice softened as he continued, "You might not believe me, but walking away was the hardest decision I ever made, because like you, I never stopped loving you. Even knowing what you did, I couldn't stop loving you. I just couldn't forgive you. And I knew I'd never forget." "Rick, please, let's not go there. I understand, and I don't blame you for not forgiving me. I know what I did, and I carry that shame. You've been fair with me, always cooperative when it came to our sons. You've never thrown my mistakes in my face. All I can say is thank you for giving me this time to say what I needed to. It's a gift I'll always cherish. Thank you." Rick looked at me with that unfamiliar expression again. I didn't fully understand it, but it wasn't anger or resentment, so I was grateful. I felt good, like maybe we could become friends again. I wanted to steer the conversation to safer ground. "Tell me about Jean Chambers. Last I heard she was heading towards Sirius. Is she about to become the next Mrs. Proctor?" My stomach flipped at the mention of her, but I thought if I brought it up, he'd feel comfortable mentioning his future plans. His expression shifted to surprise. Maybe he hadn't planned to talk about her. Maybe it was still too soon. He shook his head and said, "I haven't seen Jean in almost 2 years. Surprised you even remembered her." "Really? You mentioned once that you thought you might actually love her. I assumed marriage was in the cards." I was smitten at the time. She was young, ambitious, and I thought I could keep up. Boy, was I wrong. We broke up not long after. "I said I'm not seeing anyone now. Haven't been with anyone since her." "But why?" I couldn't help asking. "You're still as attractive as ever, and you have everything a woman would want. You're successful, good-looking, great in bed, and well off. What's stopping you?" "I just haven't found anyone who satisfies me completely. The women I've dated were either too pushy, not assertive enough, bad in bed, or just looking for someone to take care of them. None of them had what I needed. He paused, then looked at me seriously. There was one who had it all, but it didn't work out. I took the bait, eager to hear more. This was my Rick. Even if what he said hurt me, it was wonderful to just sit here and talk with him. Why didn't it work out? Was she foolish enough to let you slip away? Who was this crazy woman? It was you. And yes, she was foolish. She pushed me away. It's too bad because she was perfect for me. My breath came in shallow gasps. This was it. My chance for something I had given up hope on ever having again. If I didn't take the risk now, I would regret it forever. I might crash and burn, but I'd go down fighting. Heart in hand, I went for it. Maybe she learned her lesson, Rick. Maybe she's smarter now and knows what she'd have with a man like you. Maybe she's ready for you now, ready for a life together with all that comes with it. I'm sure she wouldn't make the same mistakes again. Do you think that's possible? Could she be different this time? Why wouldn't she make the same mistakes again? He asked quietly. I don't think I could take that kind of pain again. It hurt too much the first time. I think she'd rather die than make those mistakes again. She knows how much pain she caused those she loved. I think she'd die before doing that again. In fact, I know she would. I know it with all my heart. Rick looked at me and I held my breath. Could he forgive me? Had time softened his heart enough to dull the pain I caused him, allowing him to love me again? I looked into his eyes, holding his gaze, hoping the person I had become would be clear if he looked closely enough. He said nothing but reached for my hand. I gave it to him, still holding my breath. If he didn't speak soon, I felt like I would burst. This night had taken a turn I never expected. He had gone all the way back, offering a chance I thought was lost forever, and I wasn't sure I could hold on much longer without screaming. I believe you because I want to believe you, Judith. I have to believe you if I want to be happy. I haven't been happy in the last 8 years. I've tried to forget you and move on, but that's been a failure. None of those women were you. That's who I was searching for. I finally realized that there's only ever been one woman for me. My heart soared at his words. But then he paused and his tone shifted. But Judith, the only thing I can say today is that I forgive you. I forgive you for destroying my family and my marriage. I've tried to move on for years, but I couldn't. Something was always holding me back. Now I realize it was my anger. I'm letting it go. I don't have any emotions left that tie me to you. You said I devastated you for 8 years. No, I didn't. It was the consequences of your actions. I just reacted to what you did. Now I feel nothing for you, no anger, no hate, and finally, no love. Then he stood up and walked away. Will's team lost in the quarterfinals, but we all cheered him on. He played brilliantly, and it was enough to earn him the scholarship he had worked so hard for. His father and I were so proud of him that night. He played his heart out, but accepted the loss with grace. He went on to play in college, earned a degree in business management, and joined his father's company after graduation. He worked his way up until Rick retired and passed the business to him. Along the way, Will married Jill, his high school sweetheart, and they now have 3 wonderful children. Robert earned an academic scholarship and attended Harvard. He wanted to be a lawyer, graduated with honors, and joined a law firm in New York City. He built a reputation as a fierce attorney and eventually started his own practice. He now has a team of 4 lawyers and recently proposed to a woman he met through one of his cases. They seem deeply in love, and we are hopeful for their future. Rick and I met several times over the years. He was always polite, too polite, and I could tell it was just out of courtesy. I still loved him, but he had nothing left for me. I couldn't blame him. I had made him the man he became. I kept my company, and we stayed successful in the industry. Over time, I let my partners take on more responsibility and worked less and less. When Rick handed his company over to Will, I made the tough decision to sell mine to a group of my employees. We reached an agreement, and I finally retired. I turned 60, and everyone came to celebrate. But as I mingled, smiling and chatting with everyone, I kept looking for Rick. I laughed and made small talk, but inside I felt empty. I had a house, a car, and my sons, but no one to share my life with. Rick passed away a year later. He never remarried, all because of me. He died peacefully in his sleep. I saw him in the casket, white-haired, clean-shaven, and still handsome. Although he left me emotionally long ago, this time he was gone for good. I still visit his grave. I sit there, but I have no words for him. All I'm left with are regrets, wishing I had made different choices. But all I can do now is regret.
Discovered my wife is cheating when her affair partner punched her into the hospital. So I did this, and now years later, she can't accept my engagement to my fiancé. If ever there was a prize for the most horrible way to learn of your significant other's affair, I would probably win it and be in its Hall of Fame. Like so many people in this sub, I suddenly found myself as a member of a club that nobody ever wants to be a part of. I will never forget the sound of my sister-in-law's voice as she kept saying, I'm sorry, over and over on the phone while I drove home from a week-long business trip. I was confused and had absolutely no idea what she meant, but only after I managed to calm her down somewhat did she inform me that my wife was in the hospital and that I needed to hurry home. My mind went into overdrive as I tried to get more information as well as not crash while I began speeding to get there faster. The only thing she told me is that it was an assault, and then cut the call and wouldn't answer when I tried to call her again. A bit of background. My ex and I met in our mid-20s. It was through a mutual friend at a barbecue. At first, she seemed almost too good to be true. Not only was she incredibly beautiful, but she was also shy and introverted. It took a while for us to officially date, but once it happened, I was over the moon. When we first tried to get intimate, she suddenly started crying. She'd have taken this as a bad sign. I freaked out and thought it was something I did, but she apologized the next day and told me she was triggered. As it turns out, 2 years ago before meeting me, she was in a long-term relationship and a guy that was abusive both emotionally, physically, as well as mentally. He would degrade her during the moments of intimacy, then apologized afterward. She had a flashback, but reassured me it had nothing to do with me. So we took things slow as she was still in therapy. It was tough, but because I loved her, I believed once we got over this, it would make our relationship stronger, and for a while it honestly appeared that way. Fast forward another year, and we got engaged. First-time intimacy also happened during this stage. I was fortunate enough to be able to buy a house for us courtesy of inheritance from my late uncle. Things were going great, and I have seriously suggested we plant a peach tree, important for later on, to signify new beginnings, and she was all for it. We were wedded not long after that, and quite frankly, it was absolutely amazing. Of course, we had our normal ups and downs like every murdered couple, but I considered us more lucky because she always made it a point to never go to bed upset with each other, and she would always point out gently if I did anything that upset her. Sometime later, life basically happened and I was promoted at my job. It meant more pay, but it also meant I would be traveling more for work conferences and business meetings. I noticed she had been getting down a lot more and wasn't being as intimate as before. She would keep her phone close to her and even stopped gently addressing things that upset her. I tried to talk to her about it, but she assured me that she was fine and this was a phase she was going through and having no reason to not trust her and let it go. She would sometimes go to her sister's place and spend the night telling me she just needed a bit of girl time with her sister. The day I got that fateful phone call was the day she was meant to be keeping her sister company again. I remember rushing into the hospital barely breathing and frantically asking about my wife when world's most understanding and patient police officer sat me down to explain what happened. He told me he was a friend of my sister-in-law and he happened to respond to a domestic disturbance call. He arrived on the scene to find a couple fighting. The supposed boyfriend was on top of the female punching her and she was screaming trying to scratch him. This didn't make any sense to me because, 1, it had nothing to do with my wife because we're married, and 2, literally everyone who knew my wife knew she wouldn't do that. He gave me a knowing look and placed his hand on my shoulder, then told me to be very calm because said girlfriend was actually my wife. If it weren't for the severity of the situation, I would have laughed in his face, but something in the way he said everything made me believe him. I then was ushered in by a nurse to see my wife, and what greeted me to this day, I still can hardly find the words to describe it. I just stood there for what seemed like an eternity. Then a doctor came in and explained her injuries to me. The jaw was slightly fractured, her left eye was completely swollen shut, and had massive bruising covering half of her face as well as 3 broken ribs. Then the doctor dropped another bomb and told me she was pregnant. I still couldn't understand how this happened. Then I caught sight of her sister. She at first tried to avoid me, but at the persuasion of her police officer friend, she told me what she knew. It turns out my wife's ex had gotten in contact with her 5 months ago. He was doing this redemption pyramid step thing where he would apologize to people he has wronged in order to clear his karma. Anyone else's betrayed spouse meter going crazy right now? They began talking more, then he convinced her to meet up for coffee and show her he was a changed man. Obviously, old feelings resurfaced coupled with the fact that he appeared changed now. It soon developed into an emotional affair. My wife approached her sister for advice, who told her to take things slow and just get it out of her system if she needed to, which then led to a physical affair 3 months later. She actually told my wife that she should at least make peace with her ex in whatever form it may be, and even offer to cover for my wife once in a while. My sister-in-law was in tears at this point and kept apologizing to me, saying that she didn't know about the abuse as my wife never told anyone other than me and her therapist at the time about it. I was numb. I just couldn't feel anything and was absolutely dumbfounded by my wife's actions. When my wife finally woke up, I was there and she burst into tears upon seeing me. I spent the following months in zombie flight mode. There was individual counseling for her as well as marriage counseling for us at the strong urging of her family. In counseling, she was surprisingly forthcoming about how it happened and how she absolutely hated herself for causing me pain. She mentioned how at one point on her way home from his place, she actually fantasized about driving into the river because she smelled like him and didn't want his scent to corrupt me. However, that made sense. She said she then tried to end it, but it was too weak, and only after learning that she was pregnant that it actually woke her up and made her realize that any further contact with this man was toxic to not only her but the unborn child as well. Hence, went to end things in person for good when he snapped on her. She became a shell of herself and developed a phobia for any other males but me. At one point, she couldn't even use the bathroom at night unless I was holding her hand. Sad, right? After the baby was born, son by the way, we got our paternity test and he was mine. But the more time I spent with her, the more I realized I didn't hate my wife. I actually loathed her. I couldn't see the woman I married, but instead saw his leftovers each time I looked at her. I decided to leave because I was afraid I'd do something I'd regret and be exactly like her abusive ex. She begged me not to leave and even made the ridiculous offer of giving me a hall pass as well as slapping her if I wanted to. I knew at this point I had to get out. She was actually very generous during the divorce. She moved back into her parents and signed a very well thought out co-parenting plan issued by the courts. Moving forward 3 years later, and I meet my now fiancé by chance. I was in a bookstore with a buddy of mine, and we were discussing Egyptian mythology when this beautiful woman approached me to correct me on my pronunciation of the Egyptian god cities. Needless to say, I'm instantly impressed by not only her understanding but also by the fact that she is Egyptian herself. We exchanged numbers, which eventually led us to dating. When I finally proposed to her, it was actually in front of the peach tree I had planted years ago. I got down on one knee, but before I got my answer, she ran into the house and came out with a ring as well. Turns out she was actually planning on proposing herself because she was madly in love with me, and she didn't just want any other woman to have me. My son, in all his sweet childlike innocence, told his mother what happened because he was present when it happened. My ex literally showed up that night in the rain yelling about how could I propose to her, my fiancé, in front of our tree, and that this is the end of us. I am completely exhausted at this point. I cannot go no contact because she is the mother of my child, but she is basically harassing me and my fiancé. How do I convince her to move on, to get over her fear of men and not force me to get a restraining order? Sorry it was long, but I am really desperate. Edit. I wanted to ask a question to the insightful women of Reddit. Something that still bugs me to this day is the fact that she even made time for her ex who took pleasure in destroying her only for her to suffer a much worse fate. Is it normal for the abused to want the attention of the abuser even if she might hate him? The person who took pleasure in my ex said once. Edit 2. Forgot to add this in the original post. When my fiancée presented me with a ring which she was going to use to propose to me, she had an engraving on the inner band which dates to my pharaoh. Damn, I love this woman. Update. First off, a big thank you to the user Mama2045 for your simple yet amazing advice. Saved us a lot of trouble. Now on to what has happened so far. Since my last post, my son's birthday was coming up and he told us he wanted to have a camp night for it. Now I must explain, the boy absolutely loves the outdoors. Everything from camping to hiking to even playing in rivers are his favorite, and obviously due to an ongoing situation, we cannot go to our usual spots. So I offered my backyard for it. Another request he had was for my ex to sleep over as well. He wanted to imitate a scene from one of his kid adventure shows where both parents were sitting on either side of the child, and all three are roasting marshmallows on the campfire. Now I had absolutely no intention of denying my son's birthday wishes, but at the same time, I couldn't have my ex sleep in the same tent as me and my son. That would be far too disrespectful to my fiancée, even though she said she understood. It was clear she wasn't okay with it. My ex seemed to take advantage of this and kept saying how much she was looking forward to spending the night with her two men, and even went as far as to buy a whole lot of camping equipment that would put Bear Grylls to shame. She was certainly trying to rub it in my fiancé's face, and wasn't graceful about it either. I had to tell her to stop a couple of times, but she only relented when I threatened to invite her sister. Ever since our divorce, my ex has had a burning hatred for her sister. She, my ex, acknowledges her role in the destruction of our marriage, but blames her sister for encouraging the affair and not safeguarding from her making choices that would ruin hers, but more importantly, according to her, our life together. It's gotten so bad that she refuses to let her sister spend any significant amount of time with her son, which at one point caused my ex-sister-in-law to have severe depression. My ex-sister-in-law has been trying for years to reconcile with her sister, but it just seems to get worse as time goes on. A Redditor, Mama2045, offered me a simple and effective solution. She suggested I go out and purchase a multi-room tent, that way my fiancé could be included. I wasted no time and immediately went out to get one. Of course, my ex wasn't too happy about that, but was glad to be under the same roof as me. During the birthday celebration, my son was on cloud 9. He ran around the yard and pretended he was a great explorer discovering a new land. When evening came, I made the fire and my ex provided the marshmallows. He excitedly sat between us and started roasting his marshmallow alongside us. What I didn't expect was after we were done taking pictures and making s'mores, he handed my fiancée a stick and a marshmallow as well and sat next to her to make his second s'more. It's honestly a mystery how something this pure and perfect could come out of the absolute mess that was the relationship between me and my ex. My ex asked for a bit of my time, to which I obliged. We stepped into the kitchen and she apologized for her behavior on the day that I proposed, but not for her actions following that. She told me she still sees me as her husband in her mind, so the thought of me giving my heart to another terrified her. She said she never wanted to cause me pain and would give anything to go back in time and undo her mistakes. She mentioned how happy she was when the paternity test showed that I was the father, because she thought it was a new beginning for us and that he was proof of our love. I thanked her for the courage to share all of this, but told her I was happy with where I was in life and with whom I was with, but hoped she would find someone to make her happy as well. She said she meant what she told me on that day we divorced and will wait for me. I left the kitchen feeling exhausted because none of what I was trying to say got through to her. We decided to call it a night where me and my fiancé slept in one room with the tent and my ex with my son and another. All in all, a good birthday for my son, but not so good night for me.
DNA test reveals my wife cheated on our wedding day with my best friend, leading to ultimate revenge. "I'm out of here," I declared. "Fine, and don't bother coming back," my wife shot back. Normally I'd toss out a "go to hell" as I stormed out, but today I aimed for more civilized parting words. "We've slung similar barbs over our 14 years hitched, but this time I won't be circling back. In a few days she'll grasp what I meant this round." Over the past half year or so, Jenna, my wife, turned into a verbal wrecking ball. I couldn't figure it. Her jabs, to put it mildly, stung. I started dodging her to keep things from boiling over. Each day, I'd stall longer in the car. Sometimes, I'd slip back home after Jenna and Carrie, our 13-year-old, finished supper. I had to take care of me. Sometimes, there'd be leftovers. Lately, though, it seems they vanished before I return. I go by Kurt Kaminsky. Technically, it's David Kurt Kaminsky, but my old man's also a David, so they dubbed me Kurt from the start to sidestep confusion. Nope, not a junior. Dad's David John Kaminsky. Why he skipped the junior bit, I can't fathom. I'd happily answer to junior or even DJ, but nope, just Kurt. Or Nat. Yep, I'm Polish. Well, sort of an American with Polish roots. Heard all the jokes, well, most of them. They keep turning out new ones each year. As the lone Pole I know, apart from Dad, in this 10,000-strong town, I've become the punchline. Technically, I'm half Polish. The other half, from Mom's side, is German, French, Irish, and English. But since I'm a Kaminsky, I'm a Pole. My soon-to-be ex-wife ain't who I thought. I only caught wind of this 4 weeks back. As I said, I was keeping clear of her due to the mess. After a few dinners missed, one Monday evening, I hit a diner. In a booth, ready to order, I overheard two guys chatting in the next booth. Caught a phrase with Pole and tuned in. So, how long you been with the Pole's missus since they tied the knot? Heck, I even betted her on their wedding day, and he's clueless. The first voice, unknown. But the second, I knew. My best bud, George Carey. I froze. They kept yakking, but I heard zilch until George spilled, "Yeah, we rendezvous at least twice a month." Kurt's so clueless he doesn't even know what's going on. Dumb luck, just then the waitress came to take my order. Quietly, I murmured, "Sorry, got a jet." I bolted, making sure they didn't catch sight of me. I couldn't wrap my head around it. Jenna, my wife, with my closest buddy, the guy who stood by me at the altar. He's also my go-to mechanic, and that's not changing anytime soon. Well, not officially my mechanic, more like an exclusive contractor I rely on solely to fix and inspect all my cars. In case you're wondering, I run a used car dealership. Yeah, I'm a used car salesman. Heard all the jokes and jabs, but business is booming. People trust they're getting top-notch cars at fair prices, and if any issues crop up, I handle them. George has always been a top-notch mechanic, and I keep him busy and compensated well. I wanted to bring him on as staff, but he cracked a joke about not respecting himself if he worked for a Pole. Said it in jest, but I sensed he meant it. Still, I took him on as an independent contractor, though he wasn't all that independent. Truth is, I was his sole source of income, and that fact will be his undoing. Leaving the diner, I cruised the streets, doubting what I'd heard. Was it true, or just his boasting? I might have hired a PI, but if what he said was legit, their meetups were sparse. Might end up a waste of cash, but I decided to snoop through her phone and email. Back home, Jenna was her usual self. Fine by me, I needed the truth before talking to her. When she dozed off, I checked her email, clean. Her phone was locked, but it didn't take me long to crack it. Our daughter's birth date. Found a few sketchy messages, but nothing from George. His name in her contacts wasn't odd, considering he was my pal. Maybe he was just talking trash, I thought. Yet her recent behavior hinted something's amiss. Perhaps not with George, but someone else. I hit the hay, restless. It was past 2:43 a.m. when I finally drifted off. The next day at the dealership, George cracked his usual Polish jokes. I usually let them slide, but today I snapped. "George, what do you even know about Poland? Bet you couldn't find it on a map if your life depended on it. You joke about Poles being dim, but I'm sure they could locate the U.S., maybe even our state. Get to work." George stared, lost for words. He knew I was on to something. He wasn't the academic type, more street smart, good with engines, not textbooks. I guess that's why we hung out in high school. I'd help him with his studies, ensuring he graduated. Now I'm reconsidering our friendship. He got me thinking about picking a spouse. I retreated to my office, shut the door, and mulled over how to gather evidence. Confronting them both head-on wouldn't fly, they'd just brush it off. I needed solid proof. I rang up a PI in Santa Fe and laid out my worries. He reckoned monitoring them would cost a pretty penny given their sporadic meetups. You could slap a tracker on her phone. At least you'll know its whereabouts when you check. Or set up cameras at home, but unless they're top-notch, and by that I mean pricey, they'll likely get spotted. Even with fancy gear, if she's alert, she'll probably catch on. If I were you, I'd tag her phone and hope to catch them red-handed. He suggested a tracking program and waived off payment. "Consider it a freebie," he said. "Everything I told you is online anyway." Still, you came through with valuable advice. "Expect a check," I insisted. "If you ever swing by Silver City, drop by Kaminsky's lot," he offered. "I don't usually venture out that way, but if I do, I'll look you up," I replied, and I sensed he meant it. A big part of my sales success came from making folks feel important. Early on, I learned folks crave validation. I opted for the tracking software, saving cash and hassle on cameras Jenna might spot. That night, when everyone was out cold, I sneaked up and installed the tracking app on her phone, syncing it with mine. It'll run in the background, unbeknownst to her. Finally, I slept soundly. The next day at work, I kept tabs on the app. Jenna worked part-time at the uni bookstore, 15 to 20 hours a week. She called her earnings mad money and splurged at the salon. She hit the grocery store and later was back home. George was home most of the day, but whenever Jenna was in, he was out working, so at least for that day, I figured nothing had gone down. That evening, I tried being more civil to my wife and daughter, suggesting dinner out. My wife seemed somewhat responsive. Our daughter, typical teen, hesitated, but I insisted. Dinner went smoothly. I casually brought up George and Jenna shifted uncomfortably, swiftly changing the subject, fueling my suspicions. I want to find out if George's words hold water. I've got to get to the bottom of this somehow. That night, I refrained from checking her phone. My attempts to peek at her calls or texts came up empty. Either she swiftly deleted them or didn't make any at all. Climbing into bed, I thanked Jenna. "Thanks for joining us for dinner." "Thank you, Kurt. It was a nice surprise," she replied, meeting my gaze. "You might be in luck tonight. It's been a while, and like I mentioned, we haven't been getting along lately." After her usual nightly routine in the bathroom, Jenna nestled beside me. I felt conflicted about the possibility of closeness with her. If she had been unfaithful, did I even want it? I resolved to let her take the lead. Until I had solid evidence, I wouldn't initiate. We did end up being physically engaged, but it was rather ordinary, no need for specifics. Well, at least I enjoyed it. Throughout the week, I kept tabs on her phone's location, finding nothing out of the ordinary. On Saturday night, while she slept, I checked her phone for any messages or calls, yet again finding nothing. I was close to convincing myself that George was just blowing smoke, trying to impress someone with his tales of conquests. This wasn't the first time I'd known him to do so since our school days. I tossed and turned in bed once more, my subconscious refusing to let me sleep. At 2 a.m., I lay there, staring at the ceiling, unable to drift off. I decided to go downstairs for a drink, hoping it might help me relax. Sitting with a glass of Jack Daniels and Coke in one hand and her phone in the other, I decided to check it once more. Entering the password, our daughter's birth date, I opened her phone to the home page. Suddenly, it hit me like a bolt of lightning. Our daughter's birth date was the key. Jenna's. Pregnancy had been challenging. We had feared losing her several times due to complications. There was an issue with her Rh factor not matching Jenna's, causing her body to reject the baby. Jenna spent the last 3 weeks of the pregnancy on bed rest to ensure the baby's safe delivery, and indeed, Carrie was born exactly 9 months after our wedding. We were overjoyed at her health, but she proved to be a demanding child. She cried incessantly, had trouble sleeping, and struggled with nursing. It was tough going. In Carrie's second year, Jenna firmly declared we weren't having another child. It saddened me, but truthfully, the baby had drained much of the joy from our lives. I mentioned that she was born 9 months after our wedding. They call such children wedding night babies because they're conceived on that night or during the honeymoon. A light bulb went off in my head. If George's claims were true, then there was a strong chance Jenna was already pregnant before our wedding night. Jenna was on the pill. No, we didn't wait until marriage to be physically engaged. It was a significant part of our relationship. The doctor speculated that the stress of the wedding might have interfered with her hormones, rendering the pills ineffective. Well, if the pills failed that night, they likely failed that day too. Now I know what to do. There's a 50 to 50% chance I'm not the father. You know the saying, the early bird gets the worm. Well, George might have been an early bird, but in his case it seems the early worm gets the birdie. I got off the couch and headed to the bathroom where I found some cotton swabs. Carrie was fast asleep in her room. She finally settled into a good sleep routine at 4 years old. Before that, it was a struggle. She lay there snoring with her mouth open. It was simple to gently swab the inside of her cheek with a Q-tip. She didn't even stir. After sealing it in a plastic bag, I repeated the process for myself. Even if Carrie turned out to be my biological daughter, it still left questions about Jenna's faithfulness. If she wasn't, but I pushed those thoughts aside for later consideration. Sunday was for chores, and we each had our tasks. I took my time, avoiding Jenna and Carrie, to keep my emotions in check. I was anxious to confirm my suspicions, but plagued by doubt all day. "Something on your mind, Kurt?" Jenna inquired. I needed a quick answer, so I replied, "I'm planning to buy a bunch of cars at the next auction to stock up the lot. Money might be tight until I make some sales." Just don't overextend, she advised, always referring to the business as ours, though it was really mine. I'd say, set it up as a separate entity to protect my personal finances. Living in a religious community, I didn't want business decisions to affect my personal life negatively. I'm thinking of paying off the credit cards and keeping only one open to improve our credit, I told her. It was a tactic to mask my strategy in case she found out about it later. Do what you think is best, she responded indifferently. The idea came to me in a flash. It's amazing what your mind can do when you let it. This would minimize fallout if my suspicions prove true. So, bright and early Monday, I took the samples to Western New Mexico University and spoke with someone in the science department. They directed me to the department head, who welcomed the opportunity. I handed over some business cards and offered a 10% discount to anyone working on the samples. He seemed appreciative. I've been eyeing a new car to replace my Camry. I might swing by and check out your selection. If nothing catches my eye, I'll work with you to find something, I mentioned. Thank you, I'll keep that in mind, he replied. As I left the university, I knew I wore a smile, but it was tinged with worry. The test results could spell the end of my marriage. When I mentioned buying new cars to Jenna, it was merely a cover-up for my troubled thoughts, yet the idea started to grow on me. I summoned Paul, my accountant, loan officer, and occasional salesperson, into my office and shared my plans. We're going to make this work, I assured him. There's something else, Paul, I continued. I want to clear the mortgage on my house. Can we work out a lump sum payment? Let me crunch the numbers and get back to you after lunch, he replied, exiting my office. As he left, I pondered contacting my lawyer for a family law referral. But then I hesitated, thinking, hold your horses. Let's see the results first. I've yet to find concrete evidence of infidelity. After lunch, Paul presented the spreadsheet and we discussed the next moves for both plans. The following 2 days dragged on, each moment filled with anticipation for the DNA test results. Late Wednesday evening, the department head phoned, confirming the outcome and arranging a visit to discuss the car. When he arrived, I ushered him into my office. His expression said it all before he even spoke. The samples aren't related, he confirmed. I nodded, though the news hit hard, even though I'd half expected it. He gave me a moment before handing over the envelope with the results. When I glanced back up, my demeanor shifted. So, about that car you were eyeing, I inquired. Well, it might sound cliché, but I've hit the big 50 and I'm eyeing a sports car. Thinking of a Mazda Miata, he shared. Though I didn't have one in stock, I promised to scour the auction the next day for a well-kept one. I'll ring you this afternoon with any updates, I assured him as he left. I've told Anna I might leave early, but I'll be reachable if needed, I thought to myself, knowing she wouldn't call. She rarely required my assistance. She handled most tasks herself. As I drove around the city, everything seemed different. I made a call to my lawyer, who, though saddened by the news, directed me to a colleague he trusted. After the call, I booked an evening appointment. The next day, over a snack at a restaurant, I reflected, have I truly squandered the past 15 years? I couldn't even claim to have a child from this marriage. While I still regarded her as my child to some extent, biologically, she wasn't mine. What to do next? I couldn't pretend ignorance anymore. I'd been aware before, but now there was no turning back. One thing I was certain of, George would face consequences. It didn't matter that he'd been my closest friend for years. With friends like him, enemies seemed preferable. Jenna, too, would face repercussions. I wondered if she was aware that Carrie wasn't mine. Even if she wasn't, she kept this truth hidden from me, the secret of her infidelity on our wedding day with my best man, my supposed friend. Now I had no reason to doubt what I'd overheard. She indulged with him at least twice monthly. Anger began to well up inside me, and before it spiraled out of control, I knew I needed solitude, away from everyone. I should have called Jenna, informing her I wouldn't be home that evening. Going home was out of the question. I feared I might do something that would land me in jail. She picked up the call. Hello, Kurt. Hey, I'll be spending the night in Albuquerque to prep for the auction tomorrow at 8. Oh, I responded flatly. Well, okay then. Have a safe trip. I rarely ventured to Albuquerque for auctions, so this deviation was notable. I wondered if she'd exploit my absence for the night. She'd have to come up with an excuse regarding Carrie for my parents, which wouldn't be easy to explain. Nevertheless, I'd intermittently check her phone tracker throughout the evening to see if she ventured elsewhere. I navigated the roads to Albuquerque, aiming to purchase at least 20 cars, including a Mazda Miata. I'd arranged for their pickup and delivery to my lot post-auction. Now, the dilemma was who to entrust for their mechanical inspection. I knew George wouldn't get any further business from me once his current routine inspections and repairs were done. Upon hearing I'd acquired 24 cars, he'd likely envision dollar signs and inflate his charges, but that wasn't going to happen. I'd keep it under wraps until the last minute. I needed to consult with a local auction dealer to identify someone skilled and dependable to inspect them before shipping to our small town. Arriving in Albuquerque around 9 a.m., I checked into a Best Western hotel. Despite being the owner, I couldn't justify splurging on an expensive hotel using company funds. The room was comfortable, as was the bed, just what I needed. I'm a simple person with simple needs. Upon entering the room, I immediately checked Jenna's phone tracker, discovering she was still at home, or at least her phone was. Sleep proved elusive that night. I couldn't shake off thoughts about her actions and motivations. How could she justify her affair, especially on our wedding day, and continue it for who knows how long? I started to reassess our marriage. It was never perfect, but I believed in our exclusive love. Now, I realized it was a mistake from the very beginning. In the initial years following the wedding, things weren't smooth sailing. Naturally, we didn't anticipate a baby right away. Our original plan was to wait 3 to 4 years before starting a family. We had agreed on having 3 children before tying the knot. However, Carrie's arrival disrupted these plans. Learning that my best friend was the cause of this disruption made all the struggles seem futile. 14 years of effort seemed wasted, despite the good times we'd had being overshadowed by this revelation. If Jenna hadn't been involved with George, perhaps she would have conceived with me. Maybe her pregnancy wouldn't have been as difficult, and we wouldn't have had such a challenging child, leading her to not desire more children. George shattered my life when he seduced my future wife on our wedding day. Now he entertains her at least twice a month, all the while likely mocking me, the oblivious Pole. He must face consequences, I thought, as I lay down, attempting to calm myself and drift off to sleep. Anger simmered within me once more. I needed to regain composure or risk a sleepless night. I turned on the TV to watch a mindless comedy show. Laughter helped soothe my nerves, and I was ready to doze off, looking ahead to a busy day. The auction went smoothly. I snagged some excellent cars at favorable prices and networked with dealers in the Albuquerque area. Spotting no Miatas at the auction, I inquired with other dealers. 2 of them had one each, one red and the other black. I negotiated potential deals pending confirmation of my client's preferred color. Naturally, both dealers agreed, assuring me they'd handle the transaction. Once I provided details of the cars on my lot, I should have frequented this auction more often. Interacting with fellow businessmen in the same industry inspired me to expand my operations and provided a welcome distraction from my personal troubles. Later in the afternoon, during my meeting with the lawyer, the news wasn't encouraging. I faced losing half of my assets, along with alimony and child support payments for a child who wasn't even mine. In that moment, I decided against pursuing a divorce. Instead, I resolved to leave her with George's child, paying off the mortgage on the house. She could remain there, but with only my name on the mortgage, she wouldn't be able to sell it. By continuing to cover taxes and utilities while living elsewhere, she wouldn't have the option to resign and claim the house. However, I needed to make a decision regarding my business. Although it was registered as a corporation, I had a gut feeling that without proper protection, I could risk losing it. Consulting my business lawyer became a priority. Arriving home utterly exhausted from a demanding day, I informed Jenna of my fatigue. "I'm beat, planning to shower and hit the sack," I muttered, making my way to the bedroom. "Want dinner?" she inquired. "No, had a late lunch," I replied. At least she cared enough to ask. The shower was blissful, almost like my troubles were washing away. While problems persisted, I found solace in devising solutions. Minutes after my head hit the pillow, sleep enveloped me. The past week had been stressful, but with a plan in motion, I finally found mental reprieve. Rising early, feeling rejuvenated, I headed to the office before Jenna and Carrie stirred. There, amid spreadsheets and financial reports, I orchestrated my next moves. I briefed Paul on the 23 car purchases and instructed Anna to cease assigning work to George, emphasizing the need for secrecy. She eyed me quizzically. "You're the boss," she remarked. "Thank you, Anna. You're invaluable." At 9 sharp, I phoned my business lawyer seeking advice. "Your business is registered, but she might still force a sale to claim half its value. Consider selling preemptively," he suggested. "I can't. It's my life," I retorted. "Let me mull it over and get back to you by week's end." This news hit hard. I'd poured sweat and tears into building my business, akin to raising a child. Unlike Carrie, I thought bitterly. Rage threatened to consume me again, but as a seasoned businessman, I knew to compartmentalize. I refocused on my business agenda. First up, contacting Doug, who confirmed George's claims. "Doug, Kurt Kaminsky here. I've got intel on 2 Miatas you might fancy, red and black. Still interested? If the price is right, he replied. Which color do you prefer? Let me show you both. We'll crunch numbers afterward. Even if we can't agree, I can sell it easily, I assured. And your pick? He pressed. Red makes a bold statement but fades faster. Black's elegant but heats up quickly here. Planning to garage it? Yes, he affirmed. Red it is then. When can we meet? Monday or Tuesday. Perfect. Call upon arrival. Deal. After hanging up, I dialed the dealer with the red Miata to negotiate a swap. He showed interest in the BMW sitting on my lot for 3 months, recognizing its better prospects in a larger city. Meanwhile, George showed up with several cars still awaiting repairs. As an independent contractor, his flexible schedule suited my needs, despite my simmering anger toward him. Overhearing salesmen discussing the impending arrival of 23 cars, George inquired about the schedule. Hey Kurt, when are these cars from the auction coming in? I want to plan my repairs, he queried. The auction house will handle the delivery, likely late next week or early the following, I informed him tersely, struggling to keep calm in the presence of this betrayer. I managed to chuckle as he departed. That weekend, I distanced myself from Jenna, occupying myself with yard work and errands. Checking her phone tracker no longer concerned me. I harbored only contempt for her. Raising another man's child felt unforgivable. Monday found me back at the car show. I arranged to trade the BMW for the Miata, setting off to Albuquerque to finalize the deal. We'll grab lunch upon your arrival, the dealer suggested. Informing Anna of my day-long absence, I instructed her to hold the fort. Got it, boss, she affirmed, her reliability shining through. A raise was in order. The journey and lunch were pleasant, forging a new camaraderie with the dealer. Driving back in the Miata, wind tousling my hair, I relished the freedom. Deciding to splurge further, I resolved to procure a black car, realizing I didn't need more than a 2-seater. Soon, I pulled into our driveway in a fiery red sports car. Jenna glanced out the window and exchanged words with Carrie, prompting them both to step outside to observe. Why do you need this car, honey? We need something with a back seat for Carrie, she remarked patronizingly. Just picked it up from Albuquerque for a client. Thought you might want to take a ride, I responded. No, honey, I'm not a fan of small cars, Jenna retorted with a hint of disdain. Carrie, I called, motioning for my daughter to join us. No, Dad, I'm already teased enough because of my last name. I don't want to be seen with a Polish used car salesman. Her words stung, typical of a teenager's bluntness. I was taken aback. Where did this disrespect come from? Glancing at Jenna, I realized she was treating Carrie's remark as inconsequential. Now both the women in my house were showing disrespect. Teenagers might not always be close with their parents, but the hurtful manner in which she spoke made me question the authenticity of my family life. I'm going for another drive. I'll be back soon, I announced, shifting the car into reverse and driving off. Fueled by frustration, I navigated the roads of Silver City until I returned home around 9:30, heading straight upstairs. I took a quick shower and crawled into bed. When I didn't emerge from the shower, Jenna entered the room, casting a bright light into my eyes. Squinting, I closed my eyes. Are you sulking because we didn't choose a sports car? Aren't you going to spend time with your family? You're not just Polish, you're childish, she chided. Her sudden attitude shift puzzled me. I couldn't shake the feeling that it stemmed from George. Spending time with him had seemingly influenced her disregard for my heritage, now passed on to our daughter. Yet she wasn't even my daughter. Despite supporting her, I needed to accept that fact. Looks like you and your daughter would rather do without a pole around, so you might as well just leave, I retorted heatedly. Her demeanor only fueled my anger. She would regret treating me this way. From then on, the atmosphere in the Kaminsky household grew cold and silent. The following day, I contacted Doug, who came over to inspect the Miata. He was thrilled with it. After discussing the numbers, he was pleasantly surprised by the great deal he received, less than Kelly Blue Book. As he was finishing up the paperwork, he mentioned, my best friend handles purchasing for the university, and we rotate about cars every 2 years. It might not be much, but could you speak with him? Always happy to do business, and I'll ensure he gets a good deal, I replied. I'll have Jim reach out to you by the end of the week. Thank you, I said. That's how I expanded my business, by treating people well and showing appreciation for their referrals. On Wednesday, my lawyer called. Hey Kurt, I think I have a solution to your potential issue. Can you swing by this afternoon to discuss it? Absolutely. I'm eager to get started. The tension at home had become unbearable. At the meeting later that day, I heard the plan and was pleased with it. It would take about 2 weeks to execute, but if successful, it would be worth it. Over those 2 weeks, I gradually moved personal items and tools from my house to an apartment nearby. Meanwhile, George awaited the arrival of the 24 cars to do some work, but I kept delaying him. During the past weekend, I did some yard work and cleared out my closet and drawers when Jenna and Carrie weren't around. Jenna did laundry during the week, so she didn't notice the emptiness of my closet. This brings me back to that Monday night when I told Jenna I'm leaving. She once again began to show rudeness and disrespect, targeting me for being Polish and a used car salesman. In the past, I would go to a motel for a night or two, depending on my level of anger. The following Tuesday morning, I arrived at the parking lot early and gathered my employees in the conference room. It was a regular weekly meeting, so nothing seemed unusual. I began, "Good morning. As you all know, the cars I purchased a couple of weeks ago arrived yesterday afternoon. They've all been inspected and prepped, ready for sale. We won't be using George for any more work here. If he asks, just say we're going in a different direction. You've all been fantastic. You're like family to me, so it's tough to discuss what's next." Pausing to wipe a tear, I continued, "I've sold the business." Surprised, they looked at me, "But nothing changes regarding your roles except Anna, who will take on some of my duties and receive a corresponding raise." Despite their astonishment, they began congratulating Anna, recognizing her hard work and worthiness. "Anna, please come talk to me after the meeting. There are some things we need to discuss," I said. "I'll still be involved in the company, but only in an advisory capacity and may occasionally sell. I don't want to interfere with your sales," I assured her. They were all relieved that I'd still be around, even if only occasionally. After the meeting, as we exited, George stood there. "Hey, why wasn't I included in the meeting?" he asked, surprised. "Because it was for staff only and you're not an employee," I explained. He seemed taken aback. "I see the cars have arrived. I'll get to work on them," he said. "No need. They've already been prepared for sale," I replied firmly, leaving him stunned. "But I always check the cars," he protested. "George, I've sold the business, and the new owner wants to go in a different direction," I informed him, holding back my anger. "I'll save that for another day." I kept it brief, realizing sometimes less is more. "I can't believe you sold the business," he exclaimed, making it about himself. "Or what now?" "You can pick up your check for the past 2 weeks' work. It wasn't much. Anna rarely utilized your services," I stated bluntly. He'd been expecting to work on the cars, but he was out of luck. I felt no sympathy. I just wished I could tell him what I really thought of him. When I spoke with Anna, I asked her to keep our conversation confidential. "Of course, Kurt, I'll never divulge anything you don't want," she assured me. "Here's the plan. I've set up companies registered in Nevada. One buys the parking lot, the other buys the company. I own all the shares in both. Eventually, I'll divorce Jenna and ensure she doesn't get the business." "Why?" she asked. "I've moved out. Jenna doesn't know yet, but I'm not going back. She had an affair with George. In fact, Carrie isn't my daughter. I suspect she's George's. I'm not sure if Jenna knows, let alone George. They'll find out soon. I won't divorce, but I'll keep paying utilities and taxes for our house, so she can't claim abandonment and take everything. If she files for divorce, I don't want her to take over the business. That's why I agreed to the company being bought twice. Let them figure it out. The proceeds will be spent by the time she gets the divorce done. Plus, I barely make anything from consulting and a few commissions. Anna, you can handle daily operations. I'll be available for questions, but I trust you and your judgment," I explained. Anna smiled at the news of the new owner, but when she heard about Jenna and George, her expression turned deadly serious. This woman was someone I deeply admired and respected. "I have one more task for you before I go. I need you to order a new sign and letterhead. We're changing the business name to Helpless Car. This will reinforce the idea to George and Jenna that the business is under new ownership," I explained. I spelled out the name to ensure she got it right. She looked puzzled. "I'll explain the name choice someday. For now, just know it tells the whole story," I told her. Though she seemed puzzled, she trusted me enough to follow through with that. I bid farewell to everyone and headed out. I got into my Audi and drove towards Albuquerque. About 2 hours later, I received a call from Jenna. I hadn't expected her to call so soon. This was a familiar pattern. I'd leave for a day or two, she'd call, we'd talk, and I'd return. Things would change briefly, then revert to how they were before. We'd have another argument, and the cycle would repeat. I decided to answer the call, curious to hear what she would say this time. "Hello," I spoke through the car's speakerphone. "Kurt, what's going on?" she asked, sounding hesitant. "Nothing much, just heading to Albuquerque," I replied flatly. "Why are you going there?" she inquired. "To pick up the car," I stated without emotion. "So what I heard must not be true. George must have called you, figuratively speaking. Perhaps he asked your mistress what's going on with her husband," she speculated. I don't know, I responded. What did you hear? She pressed. George called and said you sold the business, she revealed. Why would he call you? I questioned, perplexing her. She corrected herself. Heck, your best friend. He was curious if I knew. Best friend, what a joke. I was a joke to him. The silly Pole, clueless about what's happening with his own wife behind his back. Apparently, my family felt embarrassed that I was a used car salesman, so yes, I sold the business. Now you won't have to bear that stigma anymore. Shouldn't we have discussed this first? She worried, likely concerned about our livelihood. This is my company. I owned it before we got married, and I can sell it whenever I want. I just hope the new owner treats my former employees well. Did you get a good price for it? She fretted about her standard of living. I didn't care. I just knew I needed a change. I'll start job hunting after I take some time off to relax. What about the mortgage? She panicked. I used the money to pay off the house. You only need to worry about utilities and taxes now. What about food, gas, insurance? She almost hysterically asked. Guess I overlooked those. Do you think you could work more hours? I suggested. When are you coming home? This was the moment of truth. She pressed. I won't return, I said casually. Remember what you said when I left that evening? Don't worry, I'll figure out how to cover the bills so the power won't be shut off. You can't do this, Kurt. You need to come back, she pleaded, desperation evident in her voice. No, I really don't want to, I responded impassively. Kurt, please don't do this, she cried. I've already made my decision. What about your daughter? She tried to appeal to my emotions. You mean Carrie? The girl who's ashamed of her last name and the fact that her old man is or was a used car salesman? Kurt, she's just a year-old girl. You can't take this to heart, I retorted. Well, it doesn't matter anymore. I won't be back. Again, so none of you will be embarrassed by me. With those words, I hung up and powered off the phone, letting her contemplate. I knew she'd try calling me back and grow frustrated when I didn't answer. After calming down from the call, I tried to enjoy the leisurely drive to Albuquerque. I assumed her next move would be to contact her lover for more information and to relay what I'd said. Upon reaching my destination, I switched my phone back on and noticed 5 missed messages. I listened to them, 3 from Jenna, 1 from George, and 1 from Anna. I immediately dialed Anna. Hi Anna, sorry my phone was off. I've been getting unwanted calls, I explained. Yes, I know. Your wife and George called me to find out where you were. I told them you don't own this place anymore, so you won't be coming back. Hope everything is okay, Anna informed me. Great, I replied. If they hassle you too much, tell them you'll call the police for phone harassment. I like that, she said. Kurt, you might feel like you don't have family or friends anymore, but trust me, you do. We're your family and always will be. Thank you, Anna. You know just what to say. I hope your husband realizes how lucky he is, I remarked. Trust me, he does. He tells me all the time. Never take that for granted, she assured me. I won't, I promised. After ending the call, I debated whether to call my unfaithful wife or that idiot. Nah, let them stew. Exiting the Audi, I entered the parking lot office where the owner awaited. I have that Audi I mentioned. Interested in discussing a swap, he proposed. Let's see. He admired the car's condition, inside, out, and under the hood. I could sell it in a week. Are you sure about the exchange? Feels like I'm getting the better end. You can return the favor sometime, he suggested. I'm not here to profit, just want a sports car, I replied. 30 minutes later, back on the road, top down, relishing the ride. Now, where to? North sounded good, so off to Santa Fe. Over the next 2 weeks, I journeyed through northern New Mexico, Arizona, southern Utah, and Colorado. I stayed close in case Anna needed me. I checked in with her a few times, and once things seemed settled, I headed west. Of course, they kept calling at first, annoyance, then apologies, finally, hints of resentment. I listened but shrugged it off. When they reported my canceled credit card, I chuckled. George even called, branding me a villain for leaving Jenna and Carrie. I chuckled some more. My lawyer texted me. Jenna threatened legal action if I didn't return. I returned his call. Hello, Kurt speaking. So, my wife made threats to you? Yes, but if you're still paying on the house, don't worry. She'll struggle to prove it. I assured him, I can offer something better. I have a recording where I declare my departure, and she insists I don't come back. It's gold. Send it my way, he requested. If she causes any trouble, I'll take it to her lawyer. Let them sort it out. Thanks. I'll check in next week to see how it's going. I roamed the Southwest. The Miata wasn't the coziest, but it was a blast. Caught glances, even a few flashes from bored middle-aged women, but I wasn't seeking that. After all, I was still hitched, no matter what. Drove to Reno, then Lake Tahoe, the coast, Napa Valley, and zigzagged along Highway 1, Yosemite, San Diego, Death Valley, to Vegas, then Phoenix. No rush. Chatted with folks in parking lots. Some envied a guy in his 30 seconds who could just hit the road. After approximately 3 months and covering 8,000 miles, I opted to head back to Silver City. Upon arrival at Helpless Auto, I was warmly welcomed by my entire team, including a few new faces. They all expressed joy at my return. Stepping into Anna's office, formerly mine, she looked up, spotting me. Her smile widened even more. Rising from her chair, she walked around her desk and gave me a tight hug. After chatting for a bit, I inquired, "Do you think I can treat everyone to food and drinks at Wrangler's? Can you close the store by 5? It was already 3. Absolutely, I'll make sure of it. The whole team will be there. After bidding them farewell and announcing our meeting in 2 hours, I left them in high spirits. Next, I paid a visit to my lawyer. During my travels, he informed me that Jenna had attempted to claim abandonment to seize my assets, but he managed to thwart her efforts. We discussed our next steps. At 5, I joined the team at Wrangler Restaurant. We enjoyed a fantastic dinner, and it was delightful catching up with everyone. As the evening wound down, they began to depart, leaving only Anna and me. She gazed at me and said, "You know, Kurt, you might feel powerless and lost, but you're mistaken. You simply placed trust in those you loved." I met her gaze. "So you figured it out?" "Yes, it took some time, but your mention of the new name telling the whole story lingered in my mind until I grasped it. You may be Polish, but those jokes never truly define you. They insult your heritage and who you are." "Thank you, Anna. You're the primary reason I returned. I had to witness how you handled my responsibilities. I'm pleased to say you haven't filled my shoes, you forged your own path." I had an exceptional mentor, she expressed gratitude. We embraced, and then she departed to her husband, who appeared genuinely content. I headed back to the apartment I hadn't visited in 3 months. The air was stale, necessitating some ventilation. Opening the windows, I allowed the refreshing evening breeze to permeate the rooms. I grabbed a beer and settled on the terrace overlooking the pool. Several people were swimming, and a family was enjoying themselves nearby. My mind drifted to Jenna and me. We once harbored lofty aspirations and dreams when we tied the knot. Now they seemed to have vanished. Glancing at the wall clock, I noted it was around 8:30. A realization struck me. It was time for a confrontation. I rose, hopped into my Miata, and drove to my house, technically still mine since I purchased it before marrying Jenna, and my name was the only one on the deed. Disappointment washed over me as I pulled into the driveway. The yard was unkempt. It appeared the landscaping had been neglected. The porch light was on, indicating Jenna was likely home. I approached the door and knocked. After a moment, Carrie answered. Her eyes widened as she greeted me. "Dad? Hi, Carrie. Is your mom home?" She stuttered before yelling, "Mother." From the kitchen, I heard Jenna's tense, high-pitched voice. "What's the matter?" Carrie continued to stare at me and loudly exclaimed, "Dad!" Jenna appeared from around the corner, spotting me, and shrieked, "Where are you going?" I opted to respond calmly to her outcry. "Traveling," I stated evenly. Just then, George emerged from the bedroom in his underwear. "Oh," I remarked, "the whole family is here, Mom, Dad, and child." "What the hell are you talking about?" Jenna retorted sharply. "I guess George has stepped in to fill my role." "After all, it's rightfully his," I remarked. Jenna appeared puzzled, while Carrie's tone turned visibly enraged. "Actually, young lady, you seem to be misinformed," I interjected, knowing she disliked being corrected. "George never worked for me by his own choice, so I couldn't have fired him. Regarding bills, all utilities and car insurance are covered." Jenna interrupted. "What about groceries and gas for the car? You had a job, did you lose it? It used to cover expenses while I was away. Do you think you can just waltz back in and take over?" Jenna challenged. "No, I'll wait until you and your partner find somewhere else to live." It was clear they were staying together in my house, and Carrie seemed fine with it. Jenna retorted, "I'm not leaving my home." "Correction, this is my home. It was mine before we married, and only my name is on the deed," I asserted. "You left, so now it's mine," Jenna insisted. "That's not how the law works. Since I cover the utilities and taxes, I remain the legal owner. Even though I've been away briefly, it's still mine." "Don't worry. I'll give you until the end of next month to find a new place. Just make sure you take your daughter with you." "What do you mean, your daughter? She's our daughter," Jenna protested. "You couldn't have said it more accurately," I chuckled. Jenna looked confused. Turning to Carrie, I disclosed, "Carrie, I know you dislike being called Polish, so here's some news. Your real father isn't me. It's George." Silence enveloped the room. After a moment, Jenna whispered, "What?" "Yes, Jenna. It seems your carelessness on our wedding day resulted in a child, but not mine." However, it's good news for you, Carrie. You can now take your real father's last name and become Carrie George's daughter. I wonder if perhaps Mom chose the name Carrie out of respect for her lover, I pondered aloud. Jenna and George exchanged looks, the color draining from his face. What about you, George? Don't you want to step up as a father? Well, that's unfortunate. It's time to take responsibility. But look at the bright side, it's just 4 more years until college, I remarked. Jenna and George nearly echoed each other. I don't believe this. With a swift motion, I handed them the DNA report. See for yourselves. They snatched it, glanced at it, and then both collapsed. Carrie, inform the Lovebirds that your mom will be served with divorce papers next week, along with an eviction notice, I instructed. Before walking away, throughout my absence, I couldn't shake the thought of whether this affair had been ongoing during our marriage. Did she choose me, or was I just a pawn? I felt utterly helpless, ignorant, and vulnerable. George had mocked me behind my back and even cracked polished jokes to my face. Back at the apartment, I drowned my thoughts in beer. The next morning, I visited the lawyer to initiate the paperwork. Despite knowing I'd have to sell the house and split the proceeds, being a barely working person meant I wouldn't owe alimony or child support, especially with another man in my place. Or at least, that's what I hoped for. The betrayal by Jenna and George was devastating. Rebuilding trust, whether with a man or woman, would be a daunting task. Perhaps I should consider therapy. As the divorce proceedings commenced, I returned to work at the dealership, emphasizing to my colleagues that I was no longer the boss and only needed 1 sale per week to cover my expenses. I even insisted on just 1. When faced with court-ordered child support, I ensured that my bank accounts were emptied, leaving only enough for my basic needs. At month's end, Jenna hired a lawyer, though I questioned how she could afford one. Perhaps he worked pro bono. Regardless, they'd be in for a surprise. Despite scrutinizing my accounts and the sale itself, they failed to uncover anything substantial. I learned from my colleagues that during my absence, George visited the dealership almost daily for the first 2 weeks, trying to secure work from Anna. However, she consistently turned him down. Eventually, he gave up. Now he regretted not obtaining his ASC certification, as his only job prospect was at Valine doing quick oil changes for $13 an hour. I hoped Jenna would work full-time, or they'd struggle financially. I contacted the realtor and notified Jenna that I was listing the house for sale, anticipating a 50-50th split of our assets. Since she had already received an eviction notice, she needed to vacate before the sale closed. One evening, Jenna knocked on my door and I reluctantly let her in. "What do you want?" "Kurt, can we talk?" she asked. "I'm not sure it's a good idea. We're in a legal battle," I replied. "Come on, Kurt, it's just us, no lawyers. Can we have a civil conversation?" she pleaded. "All right, but let's go to Denny's," I suggested. "There'll be witnesses," I thought to myself. I didn't trust her enough to be alone with her. At Denny's, after exchanging pleasantries, I asked, "Why, Jenna?" She hesitated before answering. "I guess the simple answer is that I liked both of you and couldn't choose." "So you were seeing both of us at the same time?" I questioned. Jenna looked down and admitted yes, but George warned me not to tell you because he knew it would ruin your relationship with him. "Then why did you say yes when I proposed?" I inquired. "Because I loved you and George," she replied. "I loved him too, but I knew he wouldn't make a good husband, so we ended things when you proposed, and I focused on us and our wedding plans." "So, on our wedding day, you were with him?" I probed. Jenna started crying and confessed, "Yes, everything was a mess then." "What was it?" I pressed further. "I didn't want to lose him, and he didn't want to lose me," she admitted. "Well, now you have each other and your child. By the way, you did a great job with the name. I didn't even realize until later during my travels that Carrie wasn't yours," I revealed. Jenna looked at me and said, "Kurt, I still love you." "It's nice to hear, Jenna, but I'm not sure you understand what love truly means," I replied. "I loved you more than anything, and clearly you can't say the same." "I loved you," she retorted, "but now I feel nothing but contempt," I stated firmly. Jenna realized our relationship was over. There would never be an us again. Before she left, I had to ask one final question. "Have you ever stopped?" After hesitating, she decided to tell the truth. "We never ceased. We had our quiet times, but we typically met twice a month," she admitted. I was hoping for a different response, but I appreciated her honesty. "One more thing, about a year ago, your behavior towards me changed." "What triggered it?" I inquired. Her face flushed red, then she grew slightly angry. "George started pushing for a bacchanalia, not involving you. I might have considered it if you were involved, but we couldn't navigate it. His persistence made me resent you for something I knew you wouldn't agree to." It's odd, but I thought I could have both of my men together and resented you for not being open to it, she confessed. Did you go through with it? I asked. No, I contemplated it, but then you left and everything fell apart, she admitted. Well, now you're free to pursue it. Your choices don't affect me anymore, I remarked. Sensing our conversation was concluding, I settled the bill and we headed to our cars. 4 months later, we stood before a judge and finalized our divorce. George was present too. Exiting the courthouse, Jenna suggested, maybe we can grab a drink the traditional way. Certainly, I agreed. Despite the previous animosity, it had dissipated. Then I thought, this marks the end of my association with them. They can now be together. Let them wallow in their own mess, they deserve each other. Ha! Jenna will have to adjust to a lower standard of living. All right, maybe the resentment hasn't completely faded, despite being Polishi demand respect.
Welcome to Lost Relation Chronicles.
I remember meeting Alistair at a party hosted by his fraternity. He stepped in when some creepy guy was hitting on me and wouldn't take no for an answer. Not long after, we started dating. It was a strange coincidence that we both came from Bay County, even though we lived in different parts, just 20 minutes apart. A few months into our relationship, I wasn't seeing anyone else. I still remember the first time we made love, 3 months after we met. He took me to a lovely restaurant, and afterward, we went dancing. We ended up making out in his car, and I was half undressed when I whispered for him to take me somewhere private. We drove to a Motel 6, and that night, we made love for the first time. From then on, we were exclusive and planned to get married after he earned his master's degree. A year after he graduated, we tied the knot. A couple of years later, Amanda was born, and 2 years after her, Andrew joined our family. We both adore our children and can't imagine life without them. Today, I'm enjoying the company's St. Patrick's Day party. We have a great spot to watch the parade. Normally, Alistair would have his car in the parade, but this year, it's not working, so he's riding with a friend. He'll call me when he's finished with the parade, and I'll pick him up a few blocks away before we come back to the party. My parents are watching the kids so we can enjoy the day. It's a casual gathering, and I'm wearing a slacks and top combo that's not too revealing but still flattering. My boss, Henry Miles, has been flirting with me all afternoon, and I've been playfully flirting back. His wife couldn't make it because she's not feeling well. You know the saying, when the cat's away, the mice will play. Henry is tall, around 6 feet, and weighs about 200 pounds. He's in great shape, with a body that would make anyone swoon. He's been putting the moves on me since I arrived, and for some reason, I've been responding. As the classic cars rolled by, I looked for Alistair but didn't spot him. I wondered where he was. After a while, I went back inside to grab another drink. Let's head upstairs to the balcony. No one's up there right now, Henry suggested. I followed him, and once we got there, he kissed me. I found myself kissing him back, and soon it became passionate. His touch set me on fire. I broke the kiss and pulled his hand away. No, someone might see us, I said, playfully shaking my finger at him. He removed his hand but pulled me closer, wrapping both arms around me for another kiss. I put my arms around his neck, and we kissed even more passionately. Suddenly, my phone rings, and I pull it out of my pocket. It's only Alistair calling, so I send it to voicemail and turn off the phone. Without hesitation, I go back to kissing Henry until we hear footsteps coming up the stairs. We quickly break the kiss and return to the party as if nothing happened. The evening continues, and I'm having fun flirting with Henry and a few of the partners. As darkness falls, any thoughts of picking up Alistair vanish from my mind. Before I know it, I find myself upstairs in a bedroom, naked, lying in bed with Henry. Oh my God, he's big. Much bigger than Alistair. Exhausted from the intensity of what just happened, we both fall asleep. The next thing I realize, it's 10 p.m., and we're the only ones left in the house. In a rush, we take a quick shower and get dressed. After a brief, lingering kiss, we leave the house and head to our cars. As I drive away, guilt begins to weigh on me. This is the first time I've ever cheated on Alistair. Panicked, I race to my parents' house to pick up the kids. They have school tomorrow, and I should have been there hours ago. I know my mom is going to give me the 3rd degree when I arrive. I pulled into my parents' driveway around 10:30 p.m. and noticed the kitchen lights were off. I knocked on the door, and after a moment, my dad finally turned on the porch light to see who was outside. He opened the door, both he and my mom standing there with confused looks on their faces. "Why are you here?" my dad asked. "I came to get the kids and take them home," I replied. At that, my mom pushed past my dad and started giving me the 3rd degree, grilling me about why I was so late. After what felt like forever, I managed to escape and headed back to my car, frustrated and fuming. I couldn't believe Alistair didn't call to let me know he had already picked up the kids. Instead, I had to stand there for 10 minutes while my mom lectured me, tearing me apart. I was steaming about it the entire drive home, and in my frustration, I didn't even think to check my phone. I pulled into our driveway around 11 p.m., parked in the garage, and walked into the house. There was Alistair, casually sitting in the living room, watching the news. Without giving him a chance to explain, I exploded. "You dirty, rotten son of a bitch. Why didn't you call me and tell me you had already picked up the kids from my mom's house, you a-hole?" I snapped, seething with anger. I had to listen to her for 10 minutes reaming me out. She was asking me why I was there, saying, "Didn't Alistair tell you he's picking up the kids? Are you two having marriage problems? Are you running around on him? Why wasn't he with you at the party?" God, she drives me nuts sometimes. I stood there, fuming, waiting for him to respond. "And you could have at least called me. Tell me, shithead, why weren't you at the party? What, are we too good for you? You're just an a-hole for doing this to me." I continued to rant, my anger boiling over. "If you'd looked at your phone or had it turned on, you would have seen I left a message that I was at the house and was going to pick up the kids from your parents' place," Alistair replied calmly. "Bullshit. I didn't see any messages on my phone," I shot back. "Did you even look? I called you 4 times to let you know I was waiting at the parking lot for you to come get me. I even texted you a few times too," he said, growing frustrated. "I never saw any messages or texts on my phone. You probably had the wrong number, a-hole. Why didn't you just walk or get a ride back to the party? 2's company, but 3's a crowd," he muttered under his breath. "What did you say, you a-hole? Are you insinuating I did something wrong? Screw you. You can kiss my butt, you maggot. You really think I did something wrong?" Alistair looked at me coolly. If the shoe fits, wear it. I could practically feel steam pouring out of my ears. I was beyond furious. "Screw you, a-hole. Don't even think about coming upstairs to my bedroom. You can sleep down here." I stomped up the stairs, my mind a whirlwind of rage. I was too pissed to even check on the kids. My thoughts were scattered, and I wasn't thinking straight. Once I got to my bedroom, I slammed the door and locked it to make sure Alistair couldn't come in. As I stood there, panting with anger, I wondered why I went off on him like that. He hadn't actually done anything wrong. Deep down, I knew it was my guilty conscience from cheating on him that fueled the outburst. I barely slept that night, tossing and turning in the dark. In the morning, I finally checked my phone. It was turned off. When I turned it back on, I had a bunch of phone messages and a few text messages from Alistair. Damn, he was right. He did call, and I sure screwed this all up. For the next 6 weeks, we avoided each other, almost like 2 cats on a hot tin roof. I was starting to get over the guilty feel, even though I am still having sex with Henry at the office. Sometimes our boss Logan Carter would join us for a threesome. It did not seem to bother me anymore that I was cheating on Alistair. I knew that my law firm would protect me. Things started to calm down in May. Alistair is back sleeping in my bed, but I still won't have any sex with him. I really don't know why I am punishing him by withholding sex. I guess I am still somewhat pissed at him. There again, I don't know why I am still mad at him. Memorial weekend, my mom and dad were taking the kids up to their cabin on Higgins Lake for the long weekend. Mom told me it was time for me to reconnect with my husband. Alistair took me out for a real nice dinner Friday night. We went dancing afterwards. It felt like we were a married couple again. When we got home, I let him have sex with me. I even participated a little bit. Saturday morning, Alistair made a nice breakfast, and when we finished cleaning up the kitchen, he told me he wanted to talk with me. We went into the living room, and he explained about his company conference in Florida. I started to get excited, until he told the dates. It took place over the same weekend that my company has a dinner and dance. There is no way that I am going to miss my company's function. We ended up having a major blow-up over the dates and functions. Sometimes Alistair can be a major a-hole. He went out to cut the grass, and I left to spend money on me for the dinner dance. I got home around 5 p.m., and Alistair is sleeping on the couch. I sneaked up the stairs with my packages and hid them in my closet. The rest of the weekend, we did not speak to each other. We had another fight as he and the kids were leaving for his conference. God, he can piss me off at times. What an a-hole he can be. Well, I have the house to myself for the rest of week and weekend. This should be a very restful week. The next 3 days just flew by. I realized that I never missed the kids or Alistair. I never gave them a call, and they never called me. So we are even. Saturday finally arrived, and I spent the whole day in the beauty salon getting ready for the party. I had the works done, hair, makeup, fingernails, and toenails painted. I went home and got dressed. The party started at 6 p.m., and I arrived 20 minutes late to make an entrance. I knew that I looked fabulous. I am sitting at a table with my boss Henry and his wife, and our senior partner Logan Carter and his wife. They had a single junior lawyer as my date. A junior partner and his wife rounded out our table. I did not know that they had some bedrooms upstairs at the country club. I had a great time drinking wine and dancing. Oh yes, and I had sex with Logan twice and the three partners once each. I even screwed my date twice. I got home around 3 a.m. sore all over. My feet hurt from dancing so much. Thank God that Alistair is not home. I don't think I could have sex with another man. I shed my clothes and crawled into bed. I got up at noon and took a nice long bath. I cleaned the house and got the clothes all washed. I knew that the kids should be home around 5 p.m. Right on cue, they drove into the driveway. I completely ignored Alistair and hugged my two kids and asked them all about their vacation. I knew that pissed Alistair off, but so what, screw him. A couple of weeks after the 4th of July, Henry started talking about the lawyers' conference at the Grand Traverse Resort in Traverse City. He told me, "Kathy, you are going to this conference, but not your husband. We don't bring our spouses to this conference. The three partners will be there, and they expect a repeat of the dinner and dance we had last month. I am excited about going to the conference." When I told Alistair about it, he just shrugged. Prick. He couldn't bring down my good mood, though. I even gave him a couple of mercy sex to keep him happy. It's finally Sunday, the day we are supposed to leave. I am packed and ready to go. We are all meeting at the office, where we will divide up into cars and head north. It was an unbelievable conference. I hardly ever left the room. There seemed to be always one of the guys there to screw me silly. For 6 days I screwed each of the 4 guys, and maybe some other guys. By the time I got home Saturday, I was whipped and screwed out. I spent Friday night with Henry, and I could not believe what he said to me. "I want to really hurt your husband," he said. "What do you want to do to him?" "I want you to have my baby." "What?" "I want you to stop taking your birth control pills, and next month stop screwing him. I am to be your only partner till you get pregnant. This way we can make him a true cuck and have him raise our child." "Oh, that sounds exciting. I will stop taking my pills right now. My period starts next week, and by the middle of September, I should be ready to conceive your child." Henry got me pregnant in September, and our plan was to have Alistair screw me silly as soon as we knew that I am pregnant. Unfortunately, Alistair did not buy into our plan, and no matter how much I tried in the next couple of months, I could never get Alistair to screw me in my fertile time of the month. "Henry, Alistair has not made love to me in 2 months. It will be hard to pin my pregnancy on him," I said. "Don't worry, baby, we will string him up to dry and force him to accept this child. I have a couple of ideas on just what to do to keep him in line," he said. In November, Henry informed me about a company cruise right after Christmas for both spouses and children. The cruise would start the 27th of December and return on January 2nd. "Kathy, you should bring your kids and husband for this cruise," he told me. "Screw Alistair. He can stay home, but I would love to take this cruise with my 2 kids," I replied. We had an odd Thanksgiving, where he went to his mother's house by himself, and I took the kids with me to my folks' house. Of course, my mother could not shut up about why Alistair was not with us for Thanksgiving dinner. We fought the whole month of December on whether the kids will go with me or not on the cruise. Finally, just before Christmas, I gave in and decided to go by myself. I am so pissed at Alistair for doing this to me. He is denying me a chance to have a vacation with the kids, just like he did last summer in Florida. December just flew by, and it was Christmas Day. Alistair and I put on an Academy Award-winning show for both the kids and our folks. We acted like the most lovey-dovey couple, fooling both folks that things were never better for us. I could not wait for the cruise to start. Finally, it is time to leave for my company cruise. I had a great time on the cruise. There was never a shortage of men for me to be entertained by. That includes the top 4 from my company. It was a refreshing cruise for me to recharge my batteries. I got home Saturday night, and the house is empty. There is a note on the table from Alistair that he and the kids would be home Monday evening. Little did I know that the dam was about to break. Monday morning at about 10 minutes before 10 a.m., I was called by Henry to come to the main conference room. When I got there, the 3 partners and Henry Miles were waiting for me. "Ethan Whitman will be here at 10 a.m. to meet with all of us." "You don't have any idea why he wants to meet with us, do you?" he asked. "I don't know who Ethan Whitman is," I replied. "He was a former partner of this firm," Henry told me. I was kind of shocked. I did not know that there was a 4th partner. I just shook my head and kept my mouth shut. There is a knock on the door, and Logan's secretary let Ethan in the conference room. "Well, Ethan, we are all here. What is it that is so important that you need to talk with all of us?" Logan Carter said. "Well, I am here representing Austin James Kelly in his divorce from Allison Joyce Kelly, Ethan said. I gave a loud gasp as the rest tried to all talk at once. My ears were buzzing. My eyes started to mist over. Everyone was talking, but it seemed like I was not hearing just what is being said. I started to feel faint. Ethan, what is going on here? Why are we all here for a divorce case? This should be handled between you and whoever Kathy gets for an attorney, Logan said. Well, you might be right, Logan, but you see there is a whole lot more here at stake than just a simple divorce. I have in my custody some information that needs to be reviewed by all 5 of you. I think that a few days should be enough for you all to review this information. Let's say that we all meet back here Friday morning at 10 a.m. Ethan said as he passed out the envelopes with Alistair's demands, the PI report, pictures, and the 2 discs. Also included were the divorce papers. Ethan got up and said to Logan, if you have any question or need me for something, you know my phone number. If I don't hear anything, I will meet you all Friday morning 10 a.m. After Ethan left the conference room, Henry walked over to me and sat down. Kathy, you don't look so good. Are you going to be all right? Henry asked me. I just nodded my head okay. He got up and walked back to his chair and sat down and started to review the information. Well, let's see just what Ethan has that he is so proud of, Logan said. While they reviewed the PI report and looked the pictures over, I started to read Alistair's demands. He wants my children. There is no way he is getting my children in a million years. He can't take my children, can he? I cried. Henry came over again and sat down next to me. Now, Kathy, calm down. Let us get through all this information, then we can start making a plan of attack, he said to me. I just nodded and sobbed onto his shoulder while he stroked my hair. He nodded at the other 3 to continue reading while he calmed me down. It looks like most of the information he has won't be admissible evidence in a court of law. He can file for divorce on a couple of motions, but in Michigan it is a no-fault state, and everything will be split 50-50ths. He would have to prove that Kathy is an unfit mother to gain custody of the children, and she would also get the house. I wonder just what he is fishing for with this entire stack of paper. Let us watch these 2 discs and see just what is on them, Logan said. You guys watch it and fill me in. Let me get Kathy out of here and back into her office. It will give her a chance to catch her breath and calm down, Henry said. The other 3 nodded their heads in agreement, and Henry led me out of the conference room. A couple days later on a Thursday afternoon, we all met in the conference room to discuss the results of the study done on the information that Ethan had given all of us. I had watched the video and listened to the audio and knew things did not sound really good for us. This is a mess, even though he can't use this information in a divorce case. If this got out, we will all be divorced and clients will leave us, and we will be ruined. This is the purest form of a blackmail case if I ever had seen one, Logan said. For the next 3 hours, we discussed every angle of the information that Ethan had left with us. The final results were that Logan, as president of the firm, would meet with Ethan tomorrow alone to try and feel him out on just what he planned to do with the information. It is Friday morning, and Logan's secretary ushered Ethan into Logan's office. Logan, is it just you and me for this meeting? Ethan said. Let's stop the posturing, Ethan. All this evidence that you have is inadmissible in court, and you know it. Maybe so, Logan, maybe so, but I don't control this information. Alistair does. He told me that he has it all set up so the information that I gave you will be made public, including to all of your wives. That includes your client list and media outlets. Is this what you want, Logan? If that happens, then Ethan, I will sue you and Mr. Kelly. I will break both of you in half. Logan, I don't control what happens with that information. Only Mr. Kelly does, and he doesn't care. It seems that your firm broke up his marriage by making his wife the company hooker. He will release that information, and you can do whatever you want to do. But the damage will be done. Okay, Ethan, where do we go from here? Do you talk for the other 4? Yes, we all agreed that I would be lead counsel on this matter. You read his list of demands. Also, he wants this divorce rushed through the courts. That is something that we both can make happen. Once the divorce is final, the rest of this will blow over. What assurance do I have that the information will never be released? I don't have an answer for that question. I know that he is using the information as protection against retribution that you might take. So that is how I lost my children to that prick Alistair. I will never forgive him for doing this to me. I will never get a chance to watch my children grow up. I think that if I was not pregnant with Henry's baby, I would probably in all likelihood kill myself. I just hope that sometime in the future, Alistair will have a change of heart and at least let me visit my 2 children. It has been 5 years since Alistair left and took my 2 kids with him. I have forgiven him for doing this to me, but I sure would love to see my 2 children again. It is May, and Alice's birthday is next month. I stopped at my folks' house to talk with Mom. I wanted to plan a nice party for Alice. Mom, next month is Alice's birthday, and I would like to plan a nice party here, so the kids can use your pool. What do you think? I asked. She has this big shit-eating grin on her face. This is so unlike my mother not to voice her opinion. It is almost like she is dangling me on a fish hook. I have a better idea. How about we take you and Alice on a trip with us to see your children in Switzerland? She said. I'm stunned. I think my mouth moved, but no words seemed to come out of my mouth. Oh, Kathy, close your mouth before you catch some flies in it. Alistair invited you and Alice to join us in our next trip to see our grandchildren. I think this would be a great birthday gift to Alice to see her stepbrother and sister. What do you think? Do you want us to get tickets for the two of you to join us on our trip in June? Of course, I said yes, and in June we left for Switzerland. It was a great trip. Alistair and Maria were very nice to me. I could see that they are very much in love with each other. I could see just what I gave up, and it just crushed me. I made some horrible mistakes, and it cost me dearly. Someday I hope to have what they have in each other. It was great to see my two kids, and we had a very good time together. Man, how the time just flew. Before I knew it, it was time to leave. Alistair and Maria were great host and hostess, and they invited us back for Christmas in Switzerland. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.
I remember the day I first met Heather. It was a cool autumn afternoon, and we were both attending a charity event hosted by Doug. I had been invited due to my work in investments, but Heather immediately caught my eye. Her laughter filled the room, drawing me toward her like a magnet. We spent the whole evening talking, sharing stories, and connecting in ways I hadn't anticipated. From that moment, I knew there was something special between us, something worth holding on to. As time went by, Heather and I became inseparable. Our relationship flourished, and after 4 years together, I felt incredibly lucky. She wasn't just my partner, she was my confidant, my best friend. We had our ups and downs like any couple, but the good times always outweighed the bad. So when Doug invited us to his New Year's Eve party at his mansion, I was thrilled. It was the perfect chance to celebrate not only the holiday, but also the life we had built together. I rang the doorbell and stepped back, waiting for Doug to answer. While we waited, I pulled Heather in for a quick hug, kissing her softly. The love I felt for her was beyond words. These past 4 years had been the happiest of my life, and tonight we were going to celebrate in style, surrounded by friends at Doug's grand New Year's party. I was eager to see Doug, but I was even more excited to spend the evening and night with my wife as we welcomed the new year. Just as I was about to ring the bell again, Doug opened the door with a grin and loudly invited us in. From the number of cars outside, I could tell it was going to be a big party, but I was still surprised by how many people were packed into his house. Doug hugged Heather tightly and kissed her cheek before pulling her inside. He then turned to me, shook my hand, and stepped aside so I could enter. A maid took our coats, disappearing with them. Doug walked between us and said, "God, I'm glad to see you too. I hate it when my parties get this big, but I feel like I have to invite everyone. Most of them are business contacts, but a few good friends like you are the ones I really want here." "Clarissa is around somewhere, probably avoiding the usual handsy crowd," he added with a chuckle. As the night went on, Heather and I danced, ate, and drank more than we probably should have. We weren't worried because we knew we had a bed upstairs. We were among the few invited to stay the night, so we didn't have to worry about driving, getting a cab, or designating a sober driver. I'm doing pretty well in the investment business, I thought to myself. In fact, I'm one of the top brokers in my office and rank high in the company. Because of this, I recognized quite a few people at the party. A lot of them, to be blunt, were available women or worse. Doug and I agreed on that. My Heather, being so beautiful, had to fend off attention just like his Clarissa did. Throughout the evening, I took the opportunity to socialize, chatting with current clients and approaching wealthier guests to potentially gain new ones. But I kept an eye on Heather too. I trusted her completely, but I'd be lying if I said I wasn't a little jealous. I watched her closely and sometimes had to step in when a man got too familiar. Whenever I'd rescue her at parties, Heather would smile and kiss me gently, often whispering, "Thank you," or "Thanks for saving me, honey." Tonight was no different. Several times, I saw her trying to slip away from someone who was a bit too close. Each time I got a smile, a touch, or a kiss, followed by her soft, "Thank you." We'd chat for a bit, maybe share a quick dance or drink, and then go our separate ways again. As the night went on, many guests left, leaving only those staying to ring in the new year with our host. That's when I noticed one man in particular. He seemed to be shadowing Heather, almost stalking her. He never strayed far and kept watching her. I recognized the look. He was completely taken with her, seizing every chance to stay close. At first, Heather ignored him or moved away, but as the night went on, she stayed with him longer, even smiling or laughing at what he said. Sometimes she lightly touched his arm. This wasn't like my Heather. She never flirted like that, especially not with a stranger. Doug must have noticed too, because just before midnight he came over to me. "Stan," Doug said quietly, "the guy with Heather is Jonathan Douglas. He's bad news, a real player. I didn't invite him, but one of the women brought him as her date. I haven't seen them together since you and Heather arrived." Doug stood next to me, carefully scanning the room. A curious look crossed his face as he continued. "Actually, I think his girlfriend already left. Now that I think about it, earlier in the evening she watched him follow Heather for a bit. Then they had a pretty heated conversation. I haven't seen her since." "Stan, he's a problem," Doug warned. "Problem with a capital P. He's married, but they're separated more often than not. He goes after married women or anyone with something he wants. He's drawn to married ladies and wealthy single women, even though he's worth millions himself. You need to watch him. He could charm a nun into bed and make her think it was her idea." For the third time that night, I went over to pull Heather away from Jonathan. He gave me the same smug look as before. But this time, Heather didn't thank me. Instead, she looked frustrated and said, "Stan, what's up with you tonight? You saw I was enjoying my conversation with Jonathan. Why did you feel the need to interrupt? He's not like the usual creeps you've saved me from. He's actually interesting and has hilarious stories. He's running for mayor and was telling me about the people he deals with on his campaign. When he found out I work in public information and advertising, he asked for advice on how to get his message to voters. I think he might offer me a job." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Honey, I don't care," I said firmly. "I don't trust that guy and I don't like him around you. Doug says he's bad news and a real womanizer. I've heard things about him too, and I want you to stay safe. The job he's hinting at will probably have you working non-stop." Heather glared at me for a moment, her anger flashing. I worried I'd messed everything up, but then she smiled and leaned in to kiss me, saying, "Aw, this is cute. You're jealous, but don't worry, honey. You're all mine." As we parted to mingle, something stuck with me. She said, "You're all mine," but didn't say she was mine. That thought lingered, and 3 months later I'd recall that night in painful detail. The last 2 months had been rocky at home. Soon after the party, Heather started coming home late from meetings or visits with her parents. When I asked her about it, she'd get angry and defensive, claiming she lost track of time or had to finish something before leaving. She also began volunteering for the local Republican Party after work, which ate up more of her time. Heather is a department leader, and her skills are almost legendary. She became a volunteer office manager for the local campaign, cleaning up chaos and gaining popularity. Like many clueless husbands, I noticed our Zek's life deteriorating as she spent more time away. I faced more rejections, and when we did have Zex, it was lackluster. She now treated it like an obligation, no longer the passionate, extended lovemaking we once had. She always had an excuse: too tired, too late, or not enough time. The truth was, she used to engage willingly, even enthusiastically, but now it felt like a chore. One day, I confided in Doug about the issues in my marriage. He gave me a worried look and said, "Stan, I'm beginning to think I might have played a role in your problems. I've been hearing rumors that Jonathan is involved with another married woman. Word is he met her at a New Year's party, and we both know where he was and who he spent that night with. She's also volunteering for his mayoral campaign." I felt lightheaded, my breath leaving me. Doug looked at me and asked, "Stan, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." I sat there staring at him, then replied, "Heather started volunteering at the Republican office too, about an hour after work and on Saturdays. She always comes home late and refuses to say much about it. Every time I ask, she gets defensive or angry. When she's home, she snaps if I get close to her, and she's almost violent if I try to see her undressed or initiate anything physical." Doug leaned back and pursed his lips. After a pause, he said, "Stan, I'm going to find out what's going on, and let's just say I won't let him get away with it if he's been abusing my hospitality by messing with my best friend's wife. I'd be mad if he hooked up with any married woman at my party. But your wife? That's crossing the line. I should have kicked him out when his girlfriend left, but I was too focused on being a good host. If I'm the cause of your problems, I promise to make it right. I guess I should share a bit more about Doug. He's my best friend, and I'd trust him with my life. Honestly, I'd trust him alone in a room with my wife. Even if they both hadn't had sex in a year, he'd never betray me. We're closer than brothers. Doug is smart, probably the smartest person I know. We were in the same high school class. He gave the valedictorian speech while I struggled to make the top 10 in our class of 223. He only went to college for a year before deciding it was a waste of time. He barely attended classes, never studied, but still earned a 4.0 GPA. He ended up taking just a few finance courses before teaching himself everything about investing and finance. The reason he needed to learn about it was that, during his freshman year, he inherited a little over $70,000 from his grandparents. Unlike most young people, Doug didn't blow the money. He bought a decent used truck and invested the rest in the stock market. His first 2 stock purchases were based on a broker's advice. Unsurprisingly, they were trendy picks that made money only for the broker. That made Doug furious, and he started educating himself. He watched CNBC, read books, and researched the market. Eventually, he opened a discount brokerage account online, transferred all his funds, and started trading on his own. From his first solo trade, Doug made more money than he ever did with the so-called experts. It didn't hurt that he started in the late 80s during the tech boom and dot-com craze. He got in and out of several lucrative stocks. No, he didn't profit from every trade, but he grew his wealth exponentially. He was also smart enough to move into safer stocks when the market started to decline. He bought Berkshire Hathaway shares at just over $17,000 and sold them 3 years later for $72,357 a share. By then, he was a multimillionaire and was expanding into venture capital and real estate. I graduated from college and spent 4 years working as a salesman for a restaurant chain. I didn't enjoy the travel, and I was serious about Heather, so I became a stockbroker. I managed a small part of Doug's millions. He handed me some of his investments when I was starting out, and I always suspected it was to help a friend. I felt guilty because I knew he didn't need my advice or management. It felt like charity. But Doug convinced me otherwise. His reasoning was twofold. He wanted to spread his investments across different brokerage firms for safety, and he believed I might come across valuable information that could help him. Neither of us ever considered it insider trading, but occasionally I came across something useful. We both benefited. Doug also referred many of his friends and acquaintances to me if they needed full-service brokerage, so I earned commissions from those trades. Doug didn't work for anyone else. He worked 8 to 10 hours a day for himself, researching stocks and managing his investments. He lived well and tried to bring Heather and me into his social circle. We attended countless charity events with him, often at his expense. Occasionally, I'd cover the costs, since I had an expense account as a broker. Doug and I also went to political meetings and socialized with influential people. We never missed a Friday night party at Doug's house. After Doug and I talked, we had plans to attend a $500 a plate political rally with him and his girlfriend. As usual, Doug treated Heather and me. For some reason, Heather was more reluctant than usual to go with us this time. I insisted she join me, and I still regret it. Our marriage was already heading toward disaster, especially after Doug's investigators gave me their report on Heather. But that dinner marked the real beginning of the end. When we arrived, I realized we were at a reception where the state Senate candidate was speaking in support of other state and local politicians. The ticket money went to the state Republican Party, though part of it would also support local candidates. What I hadn't realized was that the guest of honor was a mayoral candidate for our city. Of course, it was Jonathan, the a-hole. As we entered, I saw Jonathan standing at the front, smiling and chatting with local dignitaries. I felt Heather pull away slightly and turned to see what was bothering her. She was staring at Jonathan, her face glowing like a woman in love. In that moment, I feared I'd lost my wife. I asked, "What's wrong?" Heather snapped out of it and gave me a faint smile. "Sorry, dear. I just didn't realize who this dinner was for." She looked so guilty that I doubted her, but I didn't say anything. She had to have known Jonathan would be there since she was working part-time at the campaign office. Now it made sense why she was so hesitant to come. I glanced over at Doug and saw he had noticed our exchange. He turned to glare at Jonathan before putting on a smile and guiding Heather to a chair. He pulled it out for her, then sat Clarissa down next to him on his left. As I walked by, Doug called out to me, "Sorry, Stan. I didn't realize he was part of the group benefiting from our generosity. When he invited you, I saw her reaction. Buddy, I hope I'm wrong, but I've got a meeting with a friend on Monday I want you to join. How about lunch around 11:30? After finishing her meal, Heather excused herself to go to the restroom. I noticed that as she stood up, Jonathan also got up and left through a different door. I hesitated for a moment, thinking about following him, but Doug placed his hand on my shoulder and said, "No, Stan, it's already being handled. And if it's true, it's too late anyway. Just wait until Monday. Please." Later that evening, I lost track of Heather again and went searching for her. When I came back from the bathroom, I snuck onto the stage and hid behind the curtain. I could hear soft moans and hushed voices. One of them was unmistakably Heather's. I felt a surge of anger and moved toward the voices, but tripped over a rope, causing some noise. I heard Heather whisper, "Oh no, someone's coming. I need to leave. Honey, it won't help if we get caught. I'll see you at the office. I love you." I heard a quick kiss, then hurried footsteps moving away. I followed, but was too late to see anything, just assuming it was Heather and Jonathan. As I walked back, I ran into Doug in the hallway. His face was dark with anger. He grabbed me and made me stop. "Damn it, Stan," he said. "I told you to leave it alone. We need to gather information before you do something rash. If she is cheating, and I think she is, we need proof. That way you can get the best deal in a divorce if that's where this heads. The way you're acting, you're only going to get screwed over by the legal system." After calming me down a bit, Doug continued, "I saw them rushing down the other corridor. They stopped at a classroom door, and she looked around for you. When she didn't see you, she got scared and told him she thought you were trying to find them. Now she's even more suspicious, and it'll be harder to get the truth." When we returned to the table, we played it cool. We made sure Heather and others saw us laughing and passing a pocket flask. As I sat next to her, Heather shot me a look and asked, "Where were you?" Just then, Clarissa walked over to Doug, gave him a hug, and smiled at us. "Okay, you two. Next time I catch you sneaking out to your car for a drink, I'll either come with you or call the cops. Now, let me have a sip from that flask." Heather seemed to relax a bit. She turned to Clarissa and asked, "Oh my God, what were they up to? I couldn't find them earlier." Clarissa laughed and replied, "Oh yeah, I tried to catch them for my share before they went inside, but as you can see, they beat me to it." Later, during the dance, I took a turn with Clarissa. She was lost in the moment, and when I tried to glance around the room, she gently stopped me, refusing to follow my lead. She kissed me on the cheek and said, "No, Stan, you don't want to look right now. Just dance with me and try to enjoy the evening. I know what you're going through, and it's only going to get worse. But remember, Doug and I are here for you, always." I relaxed a little and returned the kiss, whispering, "Thanks for stepping in earlier. I nearly lost it, and Doug thinks that would have been a big mistake. I'm so angry at this guy, I don't know what to do." The rest of the week and weekend were rough. I swung between fear and rage. Deep down, I knew Heather had emotionally left me, and it was only a matter of time before she physically left too. We hadn't been happy for weeks. I started to distance myself from her mentally, even though I wasn't certain if she had cheated. But if she hadn't, there was still something seriously wrong, because we weren't the loving couple we used to be. Finally, the day of my meeting with Doug and his friend arrived. I had a strong feeling his friend would be a private investigator. I was nervous, my stomach in knots and dealing with heartburn. Beneath the surface, I could feel my anger simmering, and I knew Doug and his friend could see it. I was both dreading what I might learn and eager to know the truth. As I approached the table, Doug stood up, shook my hand, and pulled me into a hug. After the greeting, he introduced me to his friend, Simon Hobbs, who turned out to be an investigator. We took a minute to look over the menu and place our order with the waitress. Doug then said, "Let's get this unpleasant business out of the way." He looked at Simon, then back at me. Simon opened his briefcase, pulled out a large envelope, and handed it to me. "We've been following your wife and Mr. Douglas. Per Mr. Beaver's request, the surveillance lasted for 20 days, ending last Saturday night." He continued, "During that time, we observed that they had lunch together daily, except for Sundays when she stayed home. They dined at various upscale hotels, and after each meal, they would retire to a room rented by Mr. Douglas's campaign. On 8 separate occasions, we were able to enter the room by posing as room service. Each time neither was dressed and the bed was in use. Photos and reports are included. We also recorded audio by placing a microphone under the door. They had sex during every hotel visit." Simon paused, then added, "Additionally, we recorded multiple inappropriate encounters at the campaign office and after hours. We have photographs of them engaging in sexual acts 3 times at the headquarters and once at a party with some of Mr. Douglas's supporters." He hesitated before saying, "Perhaps the worst thing we captured involved a meeting between Mr. Douglas, your wife, and Stephen Negrano, the president of the Municipal Employees Union at the Gentlemen's Club. Negrano seemed quite taken with your wife, and we have photos of her sitting on his lap while his hand was under her dress." Simon then placed a laptop on the table and played a segment of the DVD. "You'll get a copy of this in the report, but I wanted to go over this specific incident first. My operative was excited to share this information, and I believe your lawyer will be too." Doug and I leaned in to watch. In the video, Heather was sitting between Jonathan and Stephen. The two men leaned over her, talking, while Jonathan's hands roamed. He touched Heather's bosoms and slid his hand under her skirt. At one point, Heather whispered for him to stop, but he responded, "Heather, I can feel how excited you are. You know you like this. Just relax. It's nothing unusual at this club." Jonathan then kissed her softly. She moaned, pressing herself against him as his hand continued to move under her very short skirt. From the camera angle, it was clear she wasn't wearing underwear. After Jonathan leaned back, Stephen pulled her onto his lap. She tried to resist, but he kept pulling her in, sliding his hand under her dress and unbuttoning her top to kiss her bosoms. Heather hissed, "Stop it, Stephen." Stephen then looked at Jonathan and said, "Jonathan, you know what needs to be done if you want the union's support. I want to spend the weekend with her. If you arrange that, I'll make sure the union backs your campaign." Heather, clearly distressed, tried to get up, insisting, "No, this is not happening. Let me go." Ignoring her, Stephen raised his eyebrows at Jonathan while continuing to touch her. Jonathan swallowed hard and leaned toward Heather. He said, "Honey, we really need this. Just go with him and help me out. It'll secure our future. And it's not like you haven't done this before. Just tell your idiot husband you have a meeting this weekend." In the video, Heather looked shocked and tried to resist. But then she seemed to relax. She moaned and turned toward Jonathan, kissing him. At this point, the club manager approached their table, looking nervous. He glanced at Heather, then at the men, and stammered, "Mr. Negrano, I've overlooked a lot for you, but you're becoming too obvious. Lieutenant Jones said the chief sent detectives to the club to reduce incidents like this. If they see what's happening, they'll shut me down. Could you take this to a back room or a hotel, please? This is my livelihood." Stephen laughed and looked at one of the large men sitting across the table. He said, "Hey, Ralph, why don't you give Joe a couple thousand for his trouble? The little lady and I are heading to the DoubleTree for the weekend. Make the arrangements, okay? Just frame it as a meeting of union leaders like we usually do." I felt my anger boiling over and started to stand up. I growled, "That lying woman. She wasn't at the DoubleTree last weekend. She called me on Friday evening claiming she had been assigned to a disaster relief project for work and was flying to San Francisco." Doug and Simon quickly grabbed me and sat me back down. Simon calmly said, "Please wait, sir. I'd like to fast forward and show you one more clip. Then you can read the report in full. We have some suggestions we'd like to discuss, but I figured you might want to see the footage first." Simon continued, "My operative stopped filming at the club and sent reinforcements to the DoubleTree ahead of Stanley and Heather. Once Stanley's men checked him in, they went to the bar for a few drinks. My operatives, dressed as hotel staff, followed them into the room once it was opened. After the thugs inspected the place, my team started adjusting the pillows, flowers, and other decorations, acting like they were preparing the room." Simon smiled slightly and added, "One of the senior managers even sent an assistant downstairs for fresh flowers and more champagne, giving my operatives extra time to place hidden cameras and microphones in the main room and both bedrooms." He continued, "By the time your wife and Stanley returned to the room, they were both drunk. The cameras captured everything. I'll play some of the key footage." Simon started playing the DVD on his small computer. The video showed Heather and Stanley entering the hotel room and shutting the door. Stanley immediately leaned in to kiss her. Then with a growl, he tore her blouse open, buttons flying everywhere. He yanked it off her shoulders as Heather unzipped and let her skirt fall to the floor. Since she wasn't wearing any underwear, she was left completely undressed. She stepped out of her shoes, took Stanley's hand, giggling as she led him into the master bedroom with the king-sized bed. The footage showed Heather undressing Stanley and pushing him back onto the bed. After several minutes, another man appeared in the frame. Stanley looked up at him and smiled. The man was the city services director. The video documented Heather engaging in sexual acts with both men. Simon paused the video and looked at me. "Your wife stayed in that room until checkout on Monday morning. During that time, she had sex with all the senior managers of the Municipal Employees Union and Stanley." Late Saturday night, Jonathan Douglas himself visited the room. He, Stanley, and the city services director spent most of the night with her. We have more photos and videos of these events, including footage of them discussing plans to misuse city funds to support Jonathan's mayoral campaign. Simon continued. We also have evidence of Senator Nussbaum and 2 judges involved in sexual acts with your wife and Jonathan. Jonathan traded her sexual favors for their support. Everything is documented. He paused before saying, at the campaign dinner where you tried to catch them, Jonathan and your wife were planning to have sex on stage. He had already pulled her dress down below her bosoms and removed her underwear. He was about to start when she heard you and made him stop. That's when they ran. We have photos of that as well. It's probably best you didn't cause a scene, as the photos could have made things worse for you. Simon handed me a copy of the full report. We can provide this to your lawyer if you wish. Our investigation fees include any local court testimony, should it be necessary. I'd also recommend we continue monitoring for potential criminal charges. If we give the FBI and local authorities evidence of the misuse of campaign funds and conspiracy, they're more likely to take the case seriously. Plus, if you proceed with divorce and your wife ends up facing legal trouble, you'll have a much better chance at a favorable settlement. Even though I knew this was coming, I was still upset and shocked. I couldn't believe the level of depravity and disrespect my wife had shown while under surveillance. The report revealed that she believed she was in love with Jonathan. They were actively discussing how and when she would leave me. She was even ranting about the job she'd been promised in Jonathan's administration if he were elected mayor. What shocked me the most was her willingness to spend a weekend at the DoubleTree, doing sexual acts for Jonathan and his friends, acts she had always refused to do with me. On several occasions, she even initiated sex later in the weekend during their private sessions. I always knew Heather was ambitious and admired powerful people, but I never imagined the lengths she'd go to for success. I felt physically ill. I barely ate, and I noticed Doug wasn't eating much either. After the investigator left, Doug and I sat quietly for a while, drinking in silence. Eventually, Doug said, Stanley, I'm so sorry I ruined your marriage. I take full responsibility for what's happened and intend to make it right. I know I can't undo what's been done, but I'll help you however I can. I'll find you a great divorce lawyer and support you until you're back on your feet. I got up from the table and looked at Doug. Well, start looking for that lawyer. I was about to give Heather an ultimatum. Either she straightens up or we get divorced, even before I knew for sure she was cheating. But now after seeing this, I can't believe it. I wonder when she changed, or if I just never really knew her at all. As for the rest, you know as well as I do that Heather's betrayal isn't your fault. You don't owe me anything. On Thursday, Doug called me. Hey, Stan, I found you a real shark of a lawyer. She hates cheaters and always fights for the innocent in divorce cases. She despises public figures and businessmen who use their power to manipulate women. If we play this right, you won't just get rid of Heather and keep most of your assets, but we can also take Jonathan down. Doug gave me the name and contact information of the lawyer he recommended. I called her later that day to set up a consultation. When I told her assistant who I was, she said they'd been expecting my call and scheduled me for a 9 a.m. meeting the next morning. I agreed and received a list of documents and information to bring with me. When I arrived the next morning, I was immediately shown to her office. I was impressed with my new lawyer, and we quickly got into a conversation about my goals for the divorce. I told her, I want to dissolve this marriage and keep all our property, though I know that's unlikely. I also want to go after this wife-stealing prick for everything we can. I want to ruin his chances in the mayoral race and leave him broke. Sally, my lawyer, leaned back in her chair, rocking slightly as she thought. Then she smiled and asked, Are you sure you want to go all out? Or do you want to financially destroy him, ruin his reputation, and potentially send him to prison? With the right moves, we can likely get him jailed. I've already reviewed parts of the investigator's report, and it's incredibly damaging. Sorry to say, but this case is so egregious that we could take down most of the key players involved. In fact, I'm legally obligated to hand over the report to the authorities because they've violated several federal laws. If we go to the authorities first and then file for divorce, we'll shot him harder. If you file first, he might find a way to escape or avoid punishment for a while. I replied, I don't care what we do to him and the others who slept with Heather. As painful as this is, I know Heather is the one responsible for all of this. But she couldn't have done it without him. From the moment I saw him meet her, I knew he was the one pursuing her. He kept after her until she gave in and ended up in his bed. It takes two to tango. She always wore her wedding ring, so he knew she was married. I even heard them on tape, talking about her stupid husband and planning how to treat me. When the time came for the big breakup, Sally and I worked through her questions, and I made a firm decision. I told her to prepare and filed the divorce papers immediately. We also agreed that the private investigator's report should be handed over to the FBI right away to trigger an investigation into campaign law violations and the misuse of union and city funds. Sally suggested I contact the process server to serve Heather and threaten legal action against Jonathan Douglas. She warned, if he's like most politicians, he might threaten you with physical damage, try to get you fired, or even countersue if you persist. He may also attempt to negotiate secretly and offer you a bribe. If that happens, and depending on the source of his funds, we could strike him with additional campaign law violations. Politicians often divert campaign money for personal use, and I wouldn't be surprised if he tries to do that. Sally then pulled out a tiny microphone and a recorder. I want you to keep these with you at all times. Wear the microphone hidden in your hair and keep the voice recorder in your car. The transmitter has a range of about 1 kilometer, but even if you're out of range, the recorder will capture up to 6 hours of audio. It will automatically download the recordings when you're back within range of your car. If you give me your car keys, I'll have someone install a dash cam while we finish here. She also advised, consider rehiring a private investigator, or let me hire one to continue watching your wife and Mr. Douglas. I've heard rumors that your wife isn't the first woman he's seduced, and he's used illegal means to cover things up in the past. If we can catch him discussing plans or trying to manipulate the situation, we can really nail him and your wife. I smiled and said, the private investigator I hired gave me similar advice. I still have him on retainer. The next Thursday, Sally called. Mr. Malone, we're ready to file for divorce and serve your wife. Do you still want to follow the plan and attend when she's served? Absolutely. At least that I'll get some satisfaction out of it. I thought about it and suggested, what if we serve her tomorrow night at campaign headquarters? Wouldn't that be a good time? Sally was silent for a moment and then said, no, Stan, that wouldn't be a good idea. If you serve her there and make a scene, everyone at the office will know immediately, and word will spread fast. If that happens, Jonathan might lose the election, but he won't feel pressured to bribe or negotiate with you. It's better to serve her when she's either alone or with him. Ideally, when they're alone. Okay, I get your point. How about we follow them tomorrow night? Heather usually doesn't get home until midnight on Fridays, and the investigator's report said they often spend Friday nights alone in a hotel room. It's usually the same one they use during lunch. Couldn't we serve them room service and catch them in the act? Sally agreed to hire a process server to interrupt their Friday night hotel rendezvous. When I arrived at my office, 2 men in suits were waiting for me. They introduced themselves and asked to talk about how I was managing some funds for their widowed mother. I smiled and invited them in. Once the door was closed, they showed me their FBI badges. They explained they were working on Jonathan's case based on the materials my lawyer had sent over. When they found out I planned to use a process server and record the interaction, they asked me to wear one of their devices to capture the conversation. This request made me uneasy, as I had been considering how I might make some side money off of Jonathan, my winnings, so to speak. But I couldn't come up with a good reason to refuse, so I agreed to wear their wire too. That evening, we all followed the 2 lovebirds from campaign headquarters to the hotel. They left around 7 p.m. and were in the room by 7:30. There were so many of us it felt like a parade, and I worried we'd be spotted. After they got to the hotel, we waited for almost an hour. I had the foresight to bring my camera to capture everything. I'm not usually into home movies, but in this case, I made an exception. We were just about to knock on the door when a fortunate coincidence occurred. The elevator doors opened, and a room service waiter came out, pushing a cart full of dishes. He walked toward the room and gave us a questioning look. I smiled, pointed at the door, and said, "Go ahead, be our guest. We didn't mean to interrupt Mr. Douglas's dinner. We'll just step aside for a moment." The waiter smiled and said, "No problem." He knocked on the door, and when Jonathan asked who it was, the waiter replied, "Room service." The door opened, and the waiter entered. The process server and I stayed out of sight, waiting for the waiter to leave. As he opened the door to exit, I moved forward to keep it from closing. The process server and I quietly slipped into the room, staying out of view. We waited until Jonathan and Heather started their dinner before fully entering. I was ahead of the process server when we walked in, and the sight before me was shocking and heartbreaking. Despite the detective's report, seeing it in person was far worse. Heather and Jonathan were completely undressed, sitting at a table with their meal laid out. They had ordered appetizers, dessert, and wine. Heather was sitting on Jonathan's lap, her back to him, as they fed each other while having sex. They looked completely lost in their own world, kissing tenderly as they enjoyed each other's company. I began filming as we turned the corner. Finally, I gave the process server a nod and he stepped forward. He asked, "Are you Jonathan Douglas and Heather Malone?" Heather screamed, jumped off Jonathan's lap and ran to the bed, grabbing a hotel robe to cover herself. Jonathan cursed and stood up angrily. He growled, "Yeah, I'm Jonathan. Get the hell out of my room. How did you even get in here?" The process server replied calmly, "The room service waiter let us in. Didn't you hear us ask if we could enter? I thought you invited us." He then walked further into the room and handed Heather the divorce papers, saying, "You've been served." I stepped forward, and Heather finally noticed me. "Stan, damn you, what are you doing here? And what's all this talk about divorce? If you don't stop this nonsense, I'll ruin you. You'll have nothing, and I'll take everything." I looked at her calmly and said, "No, Heather, you won't. In fact, if you know what's good for you, you'll sign the papers and accept my terms. When I'm done with you, I'll deal with your lover. I'm filing a lawsuit against him for mental cruelty and alienation of affection. Luckily, we live in a state where those lawsuits are still allowed. This could also hurt his election chances. To be blunt, you've been played, and now it's your turn to face the consequences." Heather didn't bother going home that night. I didn't see or hear from her until the following Wednesday when she called me at work. She didn't apologize or make small talk. As soon as I answered, she said, "Jonathan and I want to meet with you to settle this mess. We've booked a conference room at the hotel for tonight. Be there at 7. She didn't ask if I could come. She simply commanded it. I called Sally and told her about the call, then contacted my FBI contact. Sally insisted I go, and both she and the FBI would be there to support me in case things went sideways. When I arrived at the hotel, I asked the receptionist where the meeting was and was led down a hallway to a small conference room. A large man stood guard at the door. As I tried to enter, he stopped me. "There's a private meeting going on, sir," he said. "I know," I replied. "I'm Stan Malone, and I'm supposed to be here." After checking my ID, the guard knocked on the door. The door opened slightly, and he said, "Mr. Malone is here, sir." I couldn't hear the response, but the door closed again. The guard turned to me and said, "I'll need to search you, sir. Please empty your pockets into this tray." I emptied my pockets, and he patted me down. I was getting irritated and asked why I was being searched. The guard smirked and said, "Well, sir, political figures have been known to attract assassins, and Mr. Douglas doesn't want to take any risks." I suspected they were really searching for a wire or recording device, but didn't question it further. Fortunately, I had hidden the tiny transmitters in my long hair, glued to my head. After the search, I waited another 5 minutes before they finally opened the door and allowed me into the conference room. When I walked into the room, I saw Heather sitting at the table, looking directly at me. She looked guilty, her face and chest flushed. When she shifted in her seat, I realized she wasn't wearing any underwear. Then I glanced at Jonathan, and I nearly lost control. His eyes were gleaming, and he had a smug grin on his face, clearly gloating about having just slept with my wife. The meeting went exactly as Sally and I had anticipated. Jonathan started by threatening to get me fired from my job, and then he escalated to threats of physical damage unless I gave Heather a better deal and dropped my plans to sue him and his campaign. I leaned back in my chair and calmly said, "Listen, I know you and your cronies might be able to damage or even eliminate me, but that won't save you. I've taken precautions. If anything happens to me or my family, even an accident, several packages will be sent out automatically. You know as well as I do that not all media can be controlled, and some will publish the information, especially if I'm seriously hurt or eliminated. You'll be finished." I watched Jonathan's face fill with anger, and I saw that familiar tension in Heather's expression that meant she was furious. Smiling, I continued, "I know exactly what you were doing before I walked in here, and I have photos of you doing it several times before. In fact, I have photos and recordings from your meeting last week with union leaders and senior city officials at the hotel. Do you really think they'll thank you for dragging them into this mess? If anything happens to me, the paperwork being mailed out will expose them, Heather and you. Some of these people, let's just say, aren't ones you want to cross." Heather glared at me, while Jonathan, looking a bit sick, tried to maintain his composure. He snapped, "You heard what I said. Stop your threats and end this quietly, or else... His voice grew colder as he glared at me. Now get out of my room! I smiled and leaned forward. You know, Jonathan, I might reconsider everything if I were confident in a fair divorce settlement from my wife, I said calmly. But if this town's idiots elect you, they'll get what they deserve. I stood up, maintaining eye contact with Jonathan until he looked uneasy. I could tell it took all his effort not to look away. I chuckled softly and turned toward the door. Before leaving, I glanced back and said, "Oh, by the way, Jonathan, things are going to get very uncomfortable for you soon." Without waiting for a response, I walked out. When I got home, I found my private investigator waiting in the driveway with the FBI agent. They were ready to debrief me. After removing their microphones and packing up the equipment, the investigator smiled and said, "We got it all. After you left, Jonathan ordered his people to put you under surveillance and dig up anything they could use against you. You really rattled him." 3 days later, I followed up with Sally about the divorce. After some discussion, I brought up Jonathan. "Sally, I'm done waiting for this idiot. I told him and Heather what it would take for me to walk away, and they're still blocking me. Let's get aggressive. File the lawsuit against Jonathan. I think we should go for $10 million in damages." Sally paused to consider, then said, "Let's do it. That'll definitely get his attention and make headlines." As I left Sally's office and got into my car, I noticed one of Jonathan's thugs following me. He stepped back, grabbed his phone, and started gesturing wildly while talking. He must have overheard my conversation about the lawsuit. That evening, Jonathan called me, his voice filled with controlled fury. "Listen, idiot," he began, trying to sound calm. "Heather and I talked about the meeting, and we've decided to give you some of what you want. She'll sign the divorce papers without any changes, and she'll walk away with only her personal assets and quit her job. As for me, I'm willing to settle out of court. I'll make sure there's a voluntary settlement agreement if you promise to keep quiet about all this." I couldn't help but laugh. "Jonathan, I can promise you that I won't be the one to leak anything. But I can't control what others might do. There are probably hundreds of people who know by now that you're sleeping with my wife." There was a tense silence on the other end before Jonathan spoke again, frustrated. "Fine. I'll offer you $1 million, no questions asked, if you sign a non-disclosure agreement. Heather will hand over the signed divorce papers with your proposed terms." I shook my head, amused. "Jonathan, I just told my lawyer to file a $10 million lawsuit. You'll have to offer a lot more than $1 million to make me drop it. Heck, I could probably make more than that from book and movie deals about this story." Jonathan cursed under his breath before speaking again. "Okay, $1.7 million. That's my final offer. I'll find a way to cover it in the campaign books, but that's the best I can do." "All right, Jonathan, but you better act fast. I won't stop my lawyer until I see the money in my bank account. Here's a Cayman Islands account number." What I didn't tell him was that the account was set up in his name using his address. I hoped federal investigators would find it and trace the money from his campaign. Once the funds arrived, I planned to transfer them immediately to make sure they couldn't be taken back. Later that evening, my doorbell rang. The same guy who guarded the door during my meeting with Jonathan and Heather stood there, holding a clipboard with a one-page legal document. "Mr. Douglas asked me to bring this for your signature," he said. I glanced at it and smirked. "Looks fine, but I need my lawyer to review it first." The man frowned. "I shouldn't leave without it." I sighed and shut the door. In my office, I called Sally, explained the situation, and she agreed to come over. After an hour, she smiled after reviewing the papers and told me to sign. 3 days later, I found $1.7 million in the Cayman Islands account. That same day, my lawyer informed me Heather had signed the uncontested divorce papers, which were filed and would be final in 30 days. I quickly transferred the money internationally, moving it between banks under a fictitious name in case Jonathan tried to get it. During this time, my work suffered. My commissions dropped to half, and I struggled to focus. Colleagues often had to cover for me and earned commissions on my clients' sales. Even after the divorce was finalized, I was still distracted, making costly mistakes at work. Worse, I couldn't stop worrying that Jonathan or his friends would retaliate. One night, the doorbell rang after 9 p.m. Heather stood there crying with a fresh bruise on her face. "Stan," she whispered, "can I talk to you?" I almost shut the door but hesitated. I let her in, leading her to my office. She sat, still crying, then finally spoke. "Stan, I know it's too late, but I wanted to apologize. I realized what a huge mistake I made. Jonathan knew exactly how to manipulate me. I fell for him, And the job he promised after the election made me lose sight of us." Her sobs intensified. "I was furious with you on New Year's Eve when you tried to separate us. I was already late when you pulled me away from Jonathan. He had convinced me to sleep with him less than 3 hours after we met. I'm so sorry." Heather's voice trembled as she described how, after just a few weeks of sneaking around, she became convinced she had to fully support Jonathan. He promised to leave his wife and marry her after the election, claiming it would hurt his campaign to do it sooner. She got caught up in the dream of being a mayor's wife, and maybe even a senator's or governor's, losing touch with reality. That evening, she found Jonathan with a young campaign volunteer. "You were right, Stan," she said bitterly. "He fed her the same lies he told me. When I confronted him, he laughed and said, 'What makes you think I'd marry an old strumpet like you, especially one with a history of cheating and sleeping around?' She angrily wiped her tears and added, 'He said if I behaved, I could stay as his social secretary and entertain his important friends like before.' Sobbing, she continued, 'I slapped him and he punched me. He's ruined everything, Stan, and I know it's too late, but I wanted to apologize for what I did to us. If you can forgive me, I'd love to try again.' She gave me a hopeful, regretful look, kissed me on the cheek, and left. I watched her car speed off and sighed, wishing she'd realized all this before everything fell apart. In the days that followed, I couldn't bear to stay in the house. The memories were too painful. I listed it for sale and hired an agent to help me find a new place, somewhere free of the past. I brought in movers and a crew to clean up. Occasionally, I called Doug or Sally for updates. They told me the feds had taken over the investigation, suspecting corruption in the local police. They agreed to keep my name out of it unless absolutely necessary, and Sally reassured me the feds had enough evidence to honor that agreement. About 6 weeks later, I woke up to news that the feds had arrested everyone involved in Jonathan's scheme. They were charged with corruption, campaign violations, and racketeering. Jonathan was arrested for misusing funds and selling promises of future appointments. Surprisingly, or not, Heather was also arrested for her role. I called Sally, but all she knew was that leaks had come from other sources, not me. Everything was falling into place, and the money Jonathan paid me was safe. I couldn't help but smile, remembering how I had carefully planted incriminating documents while looking for Heather. After talking to Sally, I sat back, finally at peace. I had my revenge on Jonathan, freed myself from my unfaithful wife, and had $1.7 million to start over. Now I was free to begin a new life, find someone truly worthy, and maybe even start a family.